Vigilante Report, and I am your host, Sheila Zilinsky, flying solo this August 30th, 2014 broadcast. Doug and Joe are out of town, so a shout-out to Doug and Joe. Safe travels, mates. Folks, my special guest tonight is one of my favorite people in the world. He and I have done hundreds of hours in radio. In fact, we have had several shows and several networks, and it's always my distinct honor to chat with someone who I consider one of the most intelligent yet down-to-earth men on the planet. Love this man. My guest is none other than the renowned climatologist and best-selling author, Dr. Tim Ball. Tim speaks worldwide. He is an expert in the field of climate, and he's truly a thorn in Al Gore's side. He's been fighting the corruption of climate science, even being sued by the globalist greenies for speaking out against the green agenda corruption, and in his role in exposing ClimateGate. Doctor, welcome to the program. Glad to be with you again.
Hi, Sheila. Thanks for that wonderful introduction. It's just a pleasure to be on and the opportunity to speak and try and bring some insanity to what appears to be a world out of complete control. And I think that's some of the things we want to touch on tonight.
We're trying to bring some sanity in an insane world is right. You and I are working on a project. Our book will tie this all together, and we're tentatively titling it Cool It, Al Gore, with the subtitle The Globalist Green Agenda for Mankind. For now, that is the subtitle. We're still debating, and hopefully if everything goes well, our book will launch in the new year. Speaking of debating, folks, we have a bombshell, exciting second hour when you will get to hear for the first time anywhere on the airwaves the climate debate between Dr. Ball and Dr. Chris Keating. Chris Keating's the one that Glenn Beck announced that he was going to put out the $30,000 to anyone that could prove that man is not causing global warming. So, folks, you're the first to hear it. The audio has been edited for time to make it an hour, but it's a barn burner. And then in the third hour, when we come back from the debate, we'll open the phones wide open to hear from you. I want to know what you think about the debate, but I also want to hear what folks think about Agenda 21, the new carbon regime that we just, this week, in fact, the New York Times and elsewhere announced that Obama is working to forge a sweeping international climate change agreement to compel nations to cut their planet-warming fossil fuel emissions, but without ratification from Congress. Oh, big surprise. So negotiators are meeting with diplomats to broker a deal to reduce their carbon pollution, essentially devising a politically binding deal that would basically name and shame countries into cutting emissions. There's so much more to get into tonight, Tim, so how are you?
I'm very well, thank you. And I was just, somebody queried me about two British members of Parliament. Actually, one's a member of the European Parliament. He's totally opposed to Britain being in Europe, but he finds that he can fight better from the inside. That's Daniel Hannan. He's quite well known to American audiences because of his very clear enunciation of what Obama's doing and what's going on. But somebody said, well, you know, what chances are of their proposal to the British Parliament going through? When you read it, it actually what they're proposing, and the parallel for the audience is very much like the Tea Party. The Tea Party have been painted as an extreme right-wing group, but if you look at what they're doing, it's actually very centrist. You know, what's wrong with lower taxes, smaller government, more control for people of their own money and their own land and everything else? But the left have pulled things so far to the left that the Tea Party now is seen as extreme, and when in fact it's right in the center. And it's the shift of optics that is really got people confused. And it's like in British Columbia here, where I live and you live, we've got a party called the Liberal Party. In fact, when you look at its policies, it's very conservative by Canadian standards. And so these terminologies, these positions of where people are, it's become very confusing for people. And that, of course, has been accelerated by what Obama has been doing. Obama has been deliberately trying to paint the Tea Party and anybody to the right of center as extremist. And so this is a lot of what's creating the confusion.
Well, yeah, it's creating a lot of confusion. And just think about right now the fact that he's bypassed Congress in literally everything. I mean, it's just absolutely mind-numbing, isn't it?
Well, of course, that's the whole point about being a socialist and being to the far left, is that you pretend to be for the people, but in fact, what you want to do is take everything away from the people, to make all decisions for them, to have total government control. And that's the contradiction of it, the hypocrisy of what they claim to be doing as opposed to what they actually bring into practice and what they pass. And of course, for Obama, the Constitution and its deliberate attempts to keep the power in the hands of the people through Congress, ultimately giving them the final authority over the spending of money. And Obama, of course, is trying to end run that every single way he can. And he's done it through going through the bureaucracies, through administrative law, and of course he's doing that again now with the climate change issue. People should remember that when the Kyoto Accord came up, that was, of course, seen as an international treaty over which the Congress has control. And the Senate voted 95-0 against it.
Well, we're absolutely, there's no question at this point, we are in a post-constitutional crisis. The Appointments Clause is under attack. The Commerce Clause is under attack. First Amendment under attack. Second Amendment under attack. The 4th, the 5th, the 9th, the 10th, the 14th, and now the Treaty Clause. This is newsworthy. When you have a president who is conducting himself as a despot, this is what he's doing. And what's more amazing, Tim, is you have these so-called civil libertarians out there saying not one word, the phony, fraud, liberal, and journalists out there, crickets chirping. That's the news of the century, folks, when you have a person doing this. Does it amaze you, folks, that the same frauds who call themselves journalists say nothing about Obama, who has done more to damage our constitutional system than Nixon ever dreamed of? I can think of about 30 impeachable offenses by this commander-in-chief, but hey, we're not allowed to talk about it. But, it's incredible. And let's jump into the climate issue, Tim, because as everyone saw, of course, in New York Times, there was, Washington, everybody was posting this, that, Obama's trying to forge this sweeping international climate change agreement. And again, so it compels nations to cut their planet-warming fuel emissions, but again, without ratification from Congress, So think about that. Obama's climate negotiators are devising a politically binding deal that would basically name and shame countries into cutting their emissions. Obama, Tim, operates in a cloistered environment, but when the radical red greenies come calling and demand action, he acts then. He's going to shut down the coal mines, the steel mills, the commercial fisheries, the oil rigs. He'll shut down industry and assembly lines and public utilities. I mean, look at Paul Bledsoe. We cannot get this passed lawfully, so we'll do it how we always do it. We'll violate the law and the Constitution because, hey, if Congress won't rubber stamp, then, of course, Obama will do it himself like Mussolini. Countries would be legally required to enact domestic climate change policies. I mean, this lawless administration plans to bypass the 2/3 requirement for Senate ratification on the climate change treaty by entering into, think about this, folks, a politically binding hybrid agreement. I mean, that is unbelievable, Tim.
Yeah, well, it is, and of course, the fact that he's doing it and getting away with it is because the two things that the original founding fathers put in place as control, one, as I mentioned, was the Congress. Well, the Congress is failing miserably in its duty. To give you an example, Obama keeps blaming the Republicans for hampering what he's trying to do to save the planet and all these other things. But the reality is that the Congress are doing nothing. And then you've got Harry Reid in the Senate, where he's in his 5th year now when he has not had a budget, which he is required to have by law. Now, if you and I broke the law even once, we'd be in court.
Absolutely.
He's broken the law 5 times, and absolutely nothing is done. In fact, people aren't even talking about it. That's what's amazing. The other thing is, of course, the failure of the media. The founding fathers saw the media, much as they distrusted and disliked the media, I mean, Jefferson said, if you're more informed if you don't read the paper than if you do. But the media's role was to monitor these kinds of things, to poke in and to expose and to make the public aware of what their supposed leaders are doing. But the mainstream media have been on board with it, and particularly that's true of the climate issue. I mean, when the emails were leaked from the University of East Anglia of these scientists who were manipulating the outcome of the climate science, we saw emails from people like Seth Bornstein at the New York Times, Andrew Revkin of the New York Times, George Monbiot of The Guardian, all these left-wing media outlets, and they're emailing these people and saying, look, somebody's raised this issue. How do I deal with it? I mean, it's the complete opposite of journalism. And what's amazing is, now two of them, Revkin resigned from the Times initially because of being outed, but he's back writing the same nonsense again through other outlets. Monbiot at the Guardian said, what's going on here? And then when they had the investigations, which basically was a whitewash, he said, look, you haven't really dealt with the issue, but his paper's still writing the same stuff. And so the media and the Congress have failed. And, of course, Obama, as all dictators do, they exploit weakness. They know where people are vulnerable. And where the Congress and particularly the Congress think, oh, well, we're appeasing. We're trying to be politicians. In fact, they're not. They're abandoning their job completely. And people are mad at politicians, and it's not because they can't get along or won't get along. It's because they're not standing up with their principles. And those that do get marginalized by other politicians. I mean, the greatest attack upon the Tea Party is from Republican politicians. And it's incredible. It's absolutely incredible.
Well, apparently letting the Environmental Protection Agency run amok with regulations fulfilling candidate Obama's pledge, remember that, to bankrupt the coal industry at the time, and then enact a de facto cap-and-trade regime. The president couldn't get through Congress. I guess that's not enough, because the man who said his nomination was the moment the seas began to recede and the planet began to heal now plans to deal the rule of law in the U.S. Constitution. Yet another blow. I mean, Tim, he's doing it by agreeing to a Kyoto-like accord he can use as moral cover for further destroying the U.S. economy in lieu of an actual climate change treaty that must be ratified by two-thirds of the Senate. That has already unanimously rejected such a pact. Like, what, here they plan to sign this thing at the United Nations Summit meeting in Paris in 2015, and it's designed to bypass both Congress and the Constitution through the manipulation of language. Accords don't have to be ratified, but they commit the nations involved to action, and in this case, meeting artificial and meaningless emission targets. I mean, it's unbelievable that, this deal is grounded neither in science nor the law, but, again, in the words of Paul Bledsoe, a top climate change official under President Clinton, he said, if you want a deal that includes all the major emitters, including the U.S., you cannot realistically pursue a legally binding treaty at this time, except obviously all the major emitters will be shamed by the accord. It's a name and shame thing, isn't it?
Well, it's a name and shame thing, and it doesn't work. But what's interesting is that asking people to voluntarily do these things, they will do them voluntarily if they see some benefit in it. For example, under Bush, he asked industry to voluntarily reduce their CO2 output. And although the U.S. continued to increase its amount of CO2 output, it increased at a slower rate than any other nation on the planet. So people will do the right thing if they are included and if they accept the fact that there's a legitimate argument. But, of course, the other thing that Obama's doing with the climate change issue is it's not just undermining the U.S. economy, it's making it uncompetitive because, for example, Germany, which went to the alternate energies and shut down its nuclear plants, is now building coal plants as fast as it can. China's building 2 coal plants a week. And so by undermining the U.S. economy and using the climate change to do it, he's not only he's not reducing the amount of CO2 going into the atmosphere at all, but what he's doing is making the U.S. a very, very weak nation, and of course this is part of his anti-imperialism, anti-colonialism that he inherited from his father, and
sure.
And it's really it's amazing how he's pulled it off. But, you know, I know when I say this, there's going to be all sorts of screams about extremism. But you go back and look at what Hitler did, how he got power, burning down the Reichstag and blaming the communists for it, and all of the manipulations of the government and the process and the procedures that he did. And of course, what was interesting was people forget that Hitler was a socialist, and not only that, but his major support was from academia. And that's another part of what's going on in the U.S., the support that Obama has amongst the supposed intelligentsia who are supposed to be looking at these things. So it really amuses me when people say Obama is failing. He's not failing. He's succeeding beyond his wildest dreams. And we're dangerously people talk in climate about tipping points. That is, supposedly there's some magic point at which the climate will change in such a way that there's no way of taking it back or turning it back. I think that the U.S., in terms of politics and control, is very, very close to a tipping point politically. That whether you can somebody comes in that follows Obama will be able to recover from the damage that he's done. And it's not just because of these climate treaties, but it's also because of the changes that he's made within the different bureaucracies. Yeah. When you look at what he's doing in the Department of Justice, in the EPA, in the Bureau of Land Management, all of these things where they've got their own police forces, now very skillfully and cleverly armed by the Department of Justice and the Department of Defense with a military-style armament. You can see the pattern. It's obviously very deliberate, and all of this. And I said, who can possibly roll this back? Now, it's the same thing happening in England. Cameron, who has been speaking out about the climate change, speaking out against the ISIS and the terrorism and so on, but he's struggling to recover from the damage that Gordon Brown did as Prime Minister, where he brought in 3 million new bureaucrats into government, and he handed out so much money to the public that he bought people's votes. And of course, that's the challenge. How do you recover from the pull to the extreme left? And when you've got, as happened, and people forget this, Putin actually wrote an article in Pravda warning the U.S. against return or going to socialism. And when a guy like Putin's warning you against socialism, you know what's going on. You can Google that and check that out for yourself, but that's precisely what happened.
Well, Tim, there's just no end to everything going on. You just mentioned ISIS. I mean, we've got ISIS ramping things up. This Islamic militant group, ISIS, formerly known as Al-Qaeda in Iraq and recently branded as the so-called Islamic State, is the stuff of nightmares. These are ruthless, fanatical killers on a mission, and that mission is really to wipe out anyone and everyone from any other religion and impose Sharia law. The mass executions, beheadings, and even crucifixions, there's just like badges of pride, videotaped and uploaded for the world to see. This is the new face of evil, and I wonder if it would interest our listeners to know who helped fund it and arm these psychopaths, Tim?
Well, of course, that they always talk about follow the money. Well, it's true on the global stage, and it's true on the terrorism stage. And of course, so much of the American taxpayers' money has gone to fund these fledgling agencies. People forget that it was the U.S. government that set up and armed the Taliban. And they did it, of course, when the Taliban were fighting against the Russians in Afghanistan, not realizing that the Taliban would, if they got power, turn around and use that money and those armaments against Americans. Well, that's exactly what's happened with ISIS. Now, Obama, of course, has been fueling this. By the way, the two major sources of funding for the extreme form of Muslim that you're seeing with ISIS, one is, of course, Saudi Arabia. The other is Qatar. And Qatar is playing the game of appearing to be on the world stage, and we're friends with everybody, and we're promoting peace.
Yeah, but
everybody
terrorists
knows
have more.
The amount of money that.
Yeah, but terrorists have more control
into these extreme Islam agencies. People should also remember that Saudi Arabia it's a creation, by the way, of Britain. The king of Saud was created by Britain. It's not a traditional inheritance of monarchy, and they forget that 19 of the 21 people that flew into the buildings on 9/11 were Saudis, and they were Wahhabis. That is one of the extreme, strict segments of Islam, and Wahhabi was an imam, a prophet back in the 19th century, who said that we're drifting away from pure and absolute Islam, and we need to get back to it. And of course, I don't know how many Saudi princes there are, but there's well over 100, probably closer to 200. But almost all of them are Wahhabis. Osama bin Laden was a Wahhabi, and of course, these people are the ones that are funding. Just to give you a quick story about this, when the 9/11 occurred, about a month later, I was speaking in Pierre, South Dakota, to a group of agricultural bankers. And they said, well, what does Canada think about this situation? And I said, well, I can't speak for Canada, and in fact, most of the time I don't speak for Canada because I'm too conservative. But I said, my view is that you've really got to look at what's happening here and how you deal with it. Saudi Arabia was behind the whole 9/11 thing, both the people and the money. And I said, you've got to cut off Saudi Arabia. And, of course, I said, you'll hear the argument, and the Bush regime was part of that argument. Oh, well, we've got Halliburton, and we got the oil, and we got the AMCO, the American Oil Company, and all the rest of it, and we need their oil. And I said, you don't need their oil. That's the fallacy. I said, what you do is you go to the Saudis and you say, look, either you stop funding these extremists or we are simply going to stop buying your oil. And I can guarantee you that Saudi Arabian leaders would much prefer to have the money than to be funding the extremists. I said that they'll deal with the extremism very, very quickly. And,
well,
and of course, one of the
Tim.
bankers said, "Oh, how can we do that? We can't possibly. How are we going to get our energy supply?" Right. Well, of course, then the whole idea about self-sufficiency and so on. But at that particular meeting, and in response to that question, I said to the gentleman, I said, "You've got more oil in the Athabasca tar sands in Alberta, Canada, than in the whole of the Middle East combined."
Yes.
And, of course, I stopped, and then there was silence. And I said, how many of you have heard of the Athabasca tar sands? Not one. Now, remember, these are agricultural bankers. These are people you presume would be knowledgeable about oil and energy and money and everything else. Not one of them had heard of it. And I said, not only that, but there's more oil under Saskatchewan, tar sands oil under Saskatchewan, than there is in Alberta. And hardly anybody knows about that even today.
Well,
so
Tim,
I said,
don't you think that
don't tell me that there are not alternate sources, and if you really are up against it, that's what you've got to do. Well, of course, none of that happened, and Saudi Arabia continues to fund these extremists and appears to be very uninvolved on the surface, just as Qatar is doing it. Right. But underneath, there's all of this money funding to the policies they want of absolute Islam and Sharia law and a global caliphate. Of course, that's the ultimate goal.
Oh, is there a global caliphate? Because remember, I said on one show, I can't remember, I said, it's almost like Obama said, let me find the most stupidest guy on earth and let me make him Secretary of Defense, and the other stupidest person, let me appoint them the Secretary of State, and the third, director to the CIA. Remember Tim John Brennan calling the caliphate a feckless delusion that was never going to happen? I actually played a clip on a former show. Yet the CIA trains and arms Islamic rebels, making matters worse. And, terrorists, think about this. They have more control, more territory, more weapons, and more money than they've ever had. That's unbelievable that we, the people, are unilaterally disarming against this enemy. We're becoming isolated. We're abandoning our allies. We're leaving big chunks of the world open for these subhuman barbarians to get stronger and stronger. Our military is so badly degraded, and while the enemy's on the rise, I think let's take a macro view here. We have fewer combat-ready soldiers, Tim, than we've ever seen even before World War I. We're abandoning our borders. No one in government supports securing the borders. The stupid, I call them feckless delusion politicians, simply won't build a secure system for the border. These putzes will not do anything. And if you now support a secure and I guess a secure border and the deportation of people flooding in, you're a racist. You don't like Latinos? Oh, you must be a Tea Partier. Obama's not going to act. Congress not going to act. These putzes in Congress, no one's acting. You've got Chuck Hagel referring to ISIS as one of the most brutal, barbaric forces we've ever seen, and his words were a force we've never seen, a force and a dimension the world has never seen. But what are they doing about it? I mean, some people think the solution is wiping out the Middle East by, take care of it.
Yeah. Well, of course, one of the things it's part of the strategy is that you not only weaken the economy of the U.S., which Obama has been very carefully undermining. And by the way, to give you an idea of how devious he is and the people behind him are, think about the Obamacare health care plan. I mean, they came in with that, and they put it on the table within months of getting into power. Yet it was a 2,000-page document.
Well, like Nancy Pelosi says, hey, let's approve it, and then we'll figure out what's in it.
Yeah, but they knew what was in it, and of course, because they had spent years working on it, it was all ready to go. All they wanted to do was get control of the White House, and they did that by using an African-American or one that appeared African-American enough, because as Alan Keyes, who's always run for the U.S. president, said, he's not black enough for me. Well, of course, that's a comment only a black man could make, but I know exactly what he meant. They know that white Americans, there's certain levels of blackness that they wouldn't swallow. I call it the Harry Belafonte black. Now, I know people are going to say, oh, you're racist for saying that, but that's the reality. And of course, here comes Obama. They were able to manipulate all of his documentation, who he was, where he came from, and he came in as a brown Trojan horse into the White House. And look at the people that he brought in with him. He brought in those with the very narrow socialist extreme left agenda, and those put them in place. But then he padded it out, as you correctly pointed out, with feckless idiots. John Kerry and Hagel, and these are people, they are of the modern form of politicians. Gore's another one. They failed at everything else they've done. And so what do? They end up in politics, and they pick an agenda, they pick a thing on which to build their career, and of course one of the best ones is environmentalism, and they go out there touting this, and they'll tell lies without even batting an eye, either because they're too stupid or because they know that that's the way you play the game. And by the way, I'm always aware of what Napoleon said: don't always assign to malice what may be just ignorance. And I certainly think when I look at Kerry, I mean, Kerry's whole life has been orchestrated. He went to Vietnam, and as the Swift Boaters pointed out, he got 3 Purple Hearts, knowing that once you got 3 Purple Hearts, you were sent home. You got to go home. And what did he do? The minute he got back, he went to Congress and started his political career, appearing before congressional committees. And he's a veteran, and there we got to listen to him. And then of course he married into money, both his first and second wife. He married into the Heinz fortune. And there's that joke that I heard about it's cash and carry. Right? But these are people that are professional politicians because they simply can't do anything else. And you and I know, Sheila, there's 2 ways to get ahead in this world. One is you pull yourself up. The other is you push the other people down. And these people are very, very good at pushing other people down and making themselves appear like they're doing something meaningful and that they know what they're doing. So, yeah, you're absolutely right.
Well, we've got border chaos. We've got 375,000 pending immigration cases. They're pushing them through. Courts are in a chaotic backlog. The system is set up to fail. You got more fraudulent shenanigans by this imperial President Obama. I mean, and again, I talked about the post-constitutional crises. I never thought I'd live to see the day when we're in the situation we're in. I mean, it's more outrageous than even Nixon dreamed of here.
Yeah, well, of course, Nixon it was a different type of politician in the sense that he was quite traditionalist. I mean, he's a very clever man, but he had a blind spot about power and having control of power, and that was his downfall. But when you talk about the immigration issue, what's being practiced there? See, because Obama's not just a single-minded. Yes, he's single-minded in that he hates America. He hates what it stands for. He hates colonialism and what all of it stood for. That's the problem. But he's attacking on several different fronts. We talked about some of them. One, going through creating this UN agencies so that they have total control of things. But the other thing he's doing, and of course, he taught a course in the philosophies and ways of operating of Saul Alinsky. He didn't just practice it; he was teaching it. And of course, when you read Alinsky's Rules for Radicals, you can see laid out there exactly what Obama is doing. The first one in the Rules for Radicals is, of course, you take control of the health care, because that gives you control of 1/5 to 1/6 of the total economy. That's what's happening. The 10th one in his Rules for Radicals is that the end justifies the means. So if you have to lie to get what you want, then that's okay. And, of course, what did we see but lying about Obamacare? Yeah, you can keep your doctor, and so on. But there's another strategy, again coming out of academia, which is a very left-wing total control technique by Clower and Pivens. And what it is that you pick a particular area of government and you simply overload it. You stress it so that it fails. And then you come in and say, that form of government is a failure, therefore we've got to get rid of it. And, of course, that's what he's doing with the immigration. He's deliberately overloading it. He's deliberately flooding with these children. He's deliberately pushing it, shoving people into states that don't want them without approval, into cities, and so on. This is part of the strategy that you not only destroy the economy, but you destroy the basic structure of that economy. Now, another way that he's doing it, of course, is that he is saying, the gap between rich and poor is getting wider. But he got in there claiming that he would narrow that gap. But what he's doing in order to get rid of the existing system, that is Wall Street, the stock market, and all the rest of it, is the printing of money by the Federal Reserve, the borrowing of money on a massive scale, the raising the debt. But the printing of money, of course, is what happened in Germany, the Weimar Republic, that led to Hitler coming into power. It gave him the weapons that he needed. And, of course, if you print money, that money is going into the marketplace, but it's not doing anything. It's being used by people buying stocks, and you see the stock market going up and up and up and up, but the economy is going down and down and down.
Yeah. Because
the wealthy people are getting wealthier, and that's exactly what Obama wants. And, of course, so what he by his strategy of printing the money, is deliberately widening the gap between the rich and the poor. And then he'll turn around and say, see, I told you this was the problem. Look at those people. They've got all that money, and they're not investing it. And you hear him saying it every once in a while. They're not creating jobs. They're not putting the money back into the economy. Well, you create a bad economy, and you create rules and regulations where people say, I'm not going to start a business anymore. This is not a climate to be starting a business. There are so many rules and regulations. So, okay, I've got my money. Well, I'm just going to sit on it. Well, where did you get your money? Oh, well, the government's printing this money. And so the whole thing is deliberately orchestrated to undermine every facet of the whole American system, from top to bottom. By the way, when we were talking earlier about the military, there are 9 major aircraft carriers now in dock in Norfolk, Virginia, doing absolutely nothing. And, of course, it was the Navy that was essential in Reagan's power and control of the world. The fleets that they had, the 5th Fleet, the 6th Fleet, the Mediterranean Fleet, and so on, that you didn't have to get involved in land wars, that you could simply sit offshore and control a region. Well, Obama's undermined all of that, and deliberately so, as I said, by putting these aircraft carriers back into Norfolk, Virginia. And by the way, if you want to see what's happening in terms of power, the Soviet Union, Russia, is building up their Navy at an enormous rate, as they did in the Cold War. And China now has 70 nuclear submarines. Well, how many people know that?
Well, they have a very robust military, and they have a real juggernaut. So, I mean, what are the 3 things to ease out America as the world, fiat currency holder? Well, a big military juggernaut, a strong economy. I mean, think about the things that you need. I mean, look, and, these unscrupulous charlatans at the helm never stop because, you mentioned the Fed. Why is the Fed still churning out the money? Miss Bernanke 2.0 there, Janet Yellen, well, all hell is breaking loose in the economic world here. And I was so stunned when Moscow said that Russia's biggest state-controlled mega oil producers consider using euros and yuan as a settlement currency, and then you've got China, Tim, building the biggest oil refinery in the world in Russia, in the Ukraine area. Like, that is unbelievable. I mean, I just think the death of the dollar is here, and I just don't think people can quite wrap their head around what that means. When you have Russia and Britain and India and China, this BRICS deal is quite terrifying, isn't it?
Well, of course, the BRICS deal is a response to what is happening, the domination of the world, because a lot of problems. We look at the United Nations as an agency that they're doing this whole climate change thing through. Back in 2009, one of the reasons that the emails were leaked from the Climatic Research Unit at East Anglia, where they exposed these corrupt scientists deliberately identifying CO2 as a problem to undermine U.S. industrialism, the emails were leaked in November of 2009 for a specific reason. Now, the reason was, of course, that there was a meeting coming up in Copenhagen in December of 2009 of what is called a Conference of the Parties meeting. Now, this is one of the branches of the Agenda 21. The Conference of the Parties were political agencies, mostly dominated by non-government organizations and environmentalists. And for example, at the last Conference of the Party meeting on climate, there were 6,000 people in attendance. Over half of them were NGO or environmental groups. So when you look at the breakdown of what's going on, you can see the game that's playing. But anyway, what was going to happen at Copenhagen was they knew they were losing Kyoto, and so they were ready to bring in, through the United Nations, with the authorization of the science of the IPCC, to say, look, we've got to deal with this climate change issue. It's now proven. The IPCC have proven beyond any doubt. They're 97% certain, and there's that magic number again. So we've got to have a climate policy. We've got to have a global carbon tax. And that was on the schedule for Copenhagen of 2009. And the person who leaked the article, or leaked the emails of the corrupt science, knew that the Conference of the Parties would be undermined very dramatically if it was shown that the science on which they were claiming to base their policy was corrupt. That's why the emails were leaked. The person who leaked those emails was extremely well informed about what was going on. And, of course, by leaking those emails, it effectively undermined what was going to happen at Copenhagen in 2009. And as I said, the IMF was going to be the agency that was going to collect the carbon tax on a global basis. And, of course, the two agencies that are chosen for world domination, world government, are the World Bank and the IMF. And so the leaked emails was deliberately done. Now, of course, what they've been doing since is trying to find another way around that. That's what's going on with this Obama deal. And now, okay, so you say, well, what's that got to do with BRICS? Well, the BRICS are 5 nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, who have got together and said, hey, we're tired of being pushed around by these other governments, by these people that want a world government. We're not interested in that. We want domination ourselves. So the BRICS group got together. They represent 48% of the world's population. I think you mentioned there are 106 nations, is it, Sheila, that are involved?
It's 105 countries and over 105 countries.
Yeah. Which means that you've got over 50% of the countries in the United Nations. All right, and that's very critical because that gives you the balance of the vote. Now, what a lot of people don't know is that the BRICS are not only getting together as the growing economic powerhouses, and they're gaining strength because of what Obama's doing, but they're also setting up. They've already set up a very large fund of money to counteract the control of world finances that the IMF and the World Bank have. The other things that they're doing is taking more and more control of world trade. I mean, China, one thing people forget about China is that it now is controlling container shipping around the world. The number of containers moved on shipping are mostly done on Chinese ships. They're the world power.
Well, isn't it nice they own all our ports, too?
Well, exactly. I mean, Canadians are not aware that Prince Rupert in northern British Columbia is becoming a major port, and the Chinese bought warehousing and container facilities in there 10 years ago.
Yeah,
but the other thing that's important here, Sheila, is that the BRICS nations, but particularly China's putting up the money for it, are going to build a canal through the Isthmus of Panama, through Nicaragua, parallel to the Panama Canal, which of course then will take give them more control over shipping. Now, of course, what's interesting about that is that Nicaragua was the original place where they wanted to build the canal because it's much more sensible, it's much easier. But because of politics at the time, it went through Panama with horrendous cost and horrible loss of life in building that canal. And of course, America controlled it. And it's ironic that it was Jimmy Carter that gave away American control of the Panama Canal by giving it back to the Panamanian people. But the prices they charge for putting shipping through that are just unbelievably high. But if you have a parallel canal, and in China, these BRIC nations are in control of it, it changes the whole pattern of trade in the world again. And so you can see
China
that
took control of the one in the Persian Gulf there, the Pakistani port located just on the mouth of the Persian Gulf, outside of the Strait of Hormuz too. I mean, this is unbelievable when you think of, and their crude oil was imported from the Gulf countries. I mean, the proximity of the Gulf countries to Gwadar would facilitate the oil flow to there. I mean, it's unbelievable what they're maneuvering here.
Well, it is, and just let's go back in history a little bit. There was a guy by the name of Mahan, Mahan, and he wrote about what gave the British Empire all the power. And the answer, of course, was the British Navy. Without the British Navy and the control of the oceans of the world, Britain could not have been the global power that it became. And, of course, that's the thing that Obama hates about the Brits, that they were around the world. There were all sorts of jokes about it because somebody once said that the sun never set on the British Empire. And somebody else said, yeah, that's because you couldn't trust the English in the dark. But it was control of the oceans. Now, a guy by the name of Mackinder, an Oxford professor in 1904, is sitting in his office looking at a map of the world, and this really changed the world because he said, if I wanted to control the world, what is the land region of the world that I would want to control? And he decided that the largest flat area that is effectively naturally defended is the Moscow Plain. That is, if you put a pin in Moscow and draw a 500-mile circle around it, that's the largest green area on the map anywhere in the world. Now, he said he called that the world island. Now, other people in history have seen the importance of that. That was what Napoleon was all about, why he was going after Moscow. That's what Hitler was all about, was heading towards Moscow. And so Mackinder said, if you control the world island, you can control the world. And, of course, what that did was it shifted the geopolitical thinking of world leaders away from controlling the oceans of the world, because that's what the British had done with their navy, and made land power and control of land very, very critical. Now, of course, that went through with the Treaty of Versailles and the control of land.
So would that be so back in 1943? Would that be why the German army attacked Leningrad?
Well, Hitler wanted to get control of Moscow. Oh yeah, that was the whole thinking, and so because once he gets to Britain, where else does he go from there?
Well, because the Germans launched a massive invasion of the Soviet Union with over 3 million men. I mean, enormous.
Yep.
I mean, thanks in large part to a disorganized and unsuspecting Russian army, I guess. I mean, it was unbelievable that.
Well, okay, but the Russian army did what they'd done back when Napoleon attacked. They simply, they knew they couldn't face them head on, so they simply withdrew in what was called the scorched earth policy.
Right.
They pulled all the peasants out, pulled them back, burned their farms, burned their crops, and said to the Germans, "Okay, you want to come here? What are you going to travel on? Because the further an army goes, the longer its lines of supply, and you can, of course, then you can't support that." And of course, the other thing that they relied on, which is what also defeated Napoleon and Hitler, was the cold weather, right? And so the Russians used their natural defenses of distance and so on. And by the way, the most obedient regimented army in the history of the world was the German army, but the morale started to break down because it was just literally miles and miles of miles and miles. They're crossing this great, vast expanse of the Soviet Union or Russia, and getting nowhere. And eventually, as it weakened, then the Russians started to defend. Now, the Russians, of course, were helped by the supply lines going through northern Russia. The Americans, with the Murmansk runs of supply and convoys, just like they did into Britain and other areas, and they supplied the armament that Russia needed to fight Germany.
Right. Yeah.
But anyway, back to my thesis about the world island. Now, in the 50s or so, an American political science professor by the name of Spikeman is looking at this world island and said, yeah, okay, if you control the world island, you can control the world, but you don't have to be on the island to control it. You can surround it. All right? And he was the guy that through George Ball and other American politicians created the treaty organizations. And this is where we link through into what's going on today, because the idea was, well, we've got communism in in Russia. We need to contain it because it's the world island, and if we don't contain it, it's going to break out. And so they set up the 4 treaty organizations, only one of which people know about today, which is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And then linked to that, and overlapping with it to some extent, was the Central Treaty Organization, the Middle East Treaty Organization, and the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, which completely contained the Soviet Union. And, of course, the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization collapsed with the Vietnam War, the MITO one with the conflicts in the Middle East, and the Central Treaty Organization, and the only one that's left is NATO. And of course, it was designed to contain Russia, and that's why Putin is bound and determined to defeat it. And that's part of what's going on in the Ukraine. And you see the NATO that's left absolutely feckless. And that's why Putin came out the day before yesterday and said, hey, you mess with us, we're a nuclear power, and we're not afraid to use it. I mean, it was incredible.
What's your full take on, I mean, of course, we've got about 7 minutes till we go to the top of the hour, then we're going to jump into, of course, the big, great debate, the climate debate. Okay. For those of you just tuning in, we're going to be getting into that at the top of the hour here. But what is your take on what is really happening in Russia here, Tim?
Well, of course, what's happening is around the world is that the world is reacting to the imposition of effectively one world governments with the colonialism, particularly dominated by the European nations. And, of course, they imposed boundaries around the world that put peoples together that were mortal enemies, created boundaries that make absolutely no sense. The Ukraine is a good example. I talked about Saudi Arabia. You look at Iraq, where they deliberately divided the Kurds, because the Kurds are the traditional Mongol hordes that everybody in Europe and Asia are afraid of. And so what's happening because of Obama, what would have been a gradual and hopefully peaceful transition to changing of the boundaries and recognizing natural groups and natural boundaries, this is all collapsing much, much too quickly. And of course, what that leads to is complete chaos, and that is part of the side effect of what Obama is doing.
It's amazing what he is getting away with, and that is the thing that staggers me is, again, I go back to the 30 or more maybe impeachable offenses. How is this guy still, he has no right to be in the White House, in my opinion. He has no right at all to be there.
But nobody's going to challenge an African-American president, the first one in history. And of course, this is part of why the people that have the power over him put him in there. They knew that would be the case. And of course, I think one of the faults of America, and it's unfortunately shouldn't be a fault, but is that they're too trusting. They're too willing to believe that people are going to do the right thing by America. They can't imagine that somebody, especially somebody that would be the president, would do what Obama's doing. And of course, he knows that. He knows by the time they wake up to what he's doing, it'll be too late.
But something happened recently that I find very unsettling, Tim, very troubling to the security of the U.S. and really to the allies, is a reversal of 40 years of foreign policy. Egypt was, building military and foreign policy ties, and what Obama has done is he's destroyed our foreign policy infrastructure. He's destroyed relationships that have taken decades to build. I mean, it is unbelievable. And where was the commander-in-chief when all hell was breaking? Oh, he was golfing. Oh, that's nice. It's just absolutely unbelievable. It is just, it is mind-numbing.
Of course, the thing is that what he wants is the ultimate in isolationism. He wants the U.S. just to stay within its own boundaries, not be part of the world, but particularly not be dictating or dominating the world. What he doesn't understand is that America, yes, okay, you can argue some of the things they did were wrong, but America went into other regions in order to help them come to democracy. But Obama doesn't think that that's their job, that they shouldn't be doing that. He thinks that like other pre-colonial powers, like the British, and of course his father was jailed by the British for being in the Mau Mau, he thinks that U.S. as a colonial power is going into these regions and then is going to stay there and is not going to leave and continue to dictate. But as we know, what America has done, look at the Marshall Plan. They set up Europe after the Second World War. They went in and saved them from Hitler, and then they gave them the wherewithal to create their own economies and become independent and strong on their own. That's what Kennedy was doing with the General Agreement on Trade and Tariff. He said, look, if we're all trading and we've got we're feeding ourselves and we've got world economies going on, we haven't got time to be fighting with each other. But of course, Obama doesn't see that. He doesn't see America as a different form of world power, and it's the same thing, by the way, about and we'd get into all of this after the break. But the U.S. is the first country in history to build itself upon the private ownership of land by an individual. That has never, ever occurred before. And, of course, again, that's completely contrary to Obama's view of the world.
Yes, absolutely. Well, we're at the top of the hour. Of course, my guest, if you're just tuning in, is Dr. Timothy Ball, renowned climatologist and author. Again, Dr. Christopher Keating and Timothy Ball had a 1-hour debate. I edited it down. I think I took out 7 minutes for it to be exactly an hour. And for those who don't know, Glenn Beck and others said that Christopher Keating was willing to put up a cool $30,000 for someone to prove that man isn't causing global warming. And Tim, I have to admit that although I tried to moderate fairly, I had to restrain myself from coming completely unglued during the debate. But all things aside, I controlled myself somewhat. And when we come back, folks, after the break, we will air that for the first time ever. This is on the airwaves, this debate. It was, again, edited about 6 minutes. So don't go anywhere. Everyone has been awaiting. And, of course, Al Gore has gone on record as being unwilling to debate, claiming the science is settled when it comes to climate change, global warming, and the fact that man is causing global warming. So I'm not sure when Gore was appointed our top climatologist, but anyway, moving right along, let me welcome you to my two guests that are going to debate the subject on whether or not man is causing global warming. One says no, one says yes. So Dr. Christopher Keating, according to a Glenn Beck article, agreed to shell out $10,000 to anyone who can prove his argument wrong, and his is that man is causing global warming. So that's essentially our debate today. And on the other side of the coin, Dr. Ball, you say no. And you're both going to present why you believe your argument. So let's get into it. So let me introduce my two guests. They really do have some similarities. You've both been involved with climate change for 30 years. You've both taught university for over 20 years, and you've both been in the Navy. So, Dr. Ball, you have a PhD in climatology, and you've taught climatology at university level for over 20 years. Similarly, Dr. Keating, you also have taught for over 20 years. However, you have a PhD in physics, and you've taught physics. So we're talking about the topic climate. We might have to give Dr. Ball a little bit of bonus points for actually being a climatologist, but we'll let our audience decide. So the debate today is man causing global warming? So, Dr. Keating, you are a staunch believer that yes. Now, let's jump into this. Give your side, Mr. Keating. Clarify, first of all, for me. Now, this is a quote from the article of Glenn Beck, so I always like to clarify. It says, you have been on record saying this, Dr. Keating, climate change deniers are deceiving people about global warming. Now, help me understand when you say climate change, because first of all, the climate's been changing since its inception. Do you mean those who don't believe that man is causing it, or, maybe clarify that statement first of all?
Okay. The way I use the terms, climate change is exactly what it says. The climate changes, and it does change naturally and has always changed. It can change to get warmer or it can change to get cooler. But when we talk about global warming, we are talking about climate change where it is getting warmer. And specifically, man-made global warming is when the climate is getting warmer as a result of what we have done as human beings.
Okay, just to clarify that, anthropogenic global warming is really what we're talking about then.
That's correct.
Okay, excellent. Go ahead, Doctor. Present your argument. You present your side of the coin, why you believe that human beings are causing global warming. I'll give you about 10 minutes to present your argument, and then Dr. Ball, I'll give you 10 minutes, and then you guys can exchange questions as well. So go ahead.
Okay, first let me clarify the challenge. The challenge isn't really for anyone to come and prove me wrong. What it is a put up or shut up kind of argument, because I keep having all these people come up and say there is no such thing as man-made global warming, and I can prove it. And I said, okay, here's your chance. I will give you a venue to go and do what you say that you can do. Now, that's maybe splitting hairs, but the point is I never went out to anyone and told them to disprove me. And what I'm inviting them to do is to follow through on their own statements. Now, why do I believe in global warming, specifically man-made global warming? Well, the evidence is overwhelming. If we go and look at this natural variability in the climate over history, and we have a good record of climate for the last 800,000 years, what we see is, yes, the climate changes. It does get warmer. It does get cooler. And we can go and we can identify these natural cycles that are going on that causes this. And there are lots of natural cycles. Melanchovic cycles, there's El Nino, there's the Pacific Decadal Oscillation. It goes on and on and on. There's a whole bunch of cycles, natural cycles. One of the big ones is solar activity, which is not to be confused with the solar cycle. And when we go and we look at all of these different cycles, we find that we have a correlation between the combination of these natural cycles and the natural change in the environment. What we find out is that when we look at all of these natural cycles today, what is going on is that we should be in a natural cooling cycle. And so we can't come out and look at the temperature trend, the heating of the globe, and say, hey, this is just a natural event. The science, the history shows, in fact, it is not a natural event. So something's going on. And that's one of the first criticisms, the first claim of anyone who is rejecting global warming. And so, well, it's just a natural cycle. There have been cycles in the past. Well, we know that that's not the case here. The other thing is the world is warming. Now, one of the biggest complaints people have been making is, well, the temperature has been steady for X number of years, and you fill in the number. It's been 14, 15, 17, 20 years. Depending on who you talk to, you get a different number. And this is really, it's false in two different ways. Number one, it's cherry picking. They go and they pick the start and end date that they want to get the data that they want, the result that they want. If you pick a different starting point, you get a very different result than what they are claiming. If we look at the data, the world has experienced 9 of the 10 warmest years we have ever recorded as humans since the year 2000, including the 3 hottest years. Most of the data I'm talking about comes from the NASA Goddard Institute for Space Science.
Okay,
Studies.
James Hansen's outfit. Okay, that's good to clarify that.
This is the data that most people usually talk to. But here's the biggest problem with that data is that is the surface temperature. So this is the temperature of the air and the land. But 93% of all heating of the globe goes into the ocean. So 93% of the warming is done in the ocean.
So you believe that 93% of this is trapped in the ocean then?
You know, it's just physics. A given mass of water takes 4 times as much heat to raise the same temperature as the same mass of air. And so when you go and you compare the mass of the ocean water that we're talking about, we're not talking about the entire mass of the ocean. We're talking about the upper few hundred meters of the ocean. When you compare that mass to the mass of everything else, and then you go on and you look at the heat capacity of that, then the water absorbs much, much, much more heat than air and land. And so when people go and make the argument that there's been no warming because there's been a pause in the surface temperature, well, that's not a true statement. In fact, this heating has been going on. In fact, if we include the ocean warming, it's pretty dramatic of how much heating has been going on.
When you say dramatic, sir, how much has been going on?
I don't have that data right here in front of me. I can't give you that exact number. But,
well, give me a ballpark, because when you say pretty dramatic, that means something pretty dramatic, I'm assuming.
All right.
So in the meantime, we'll go back to that. But anyway, carry on.
Additional to that, what we see is a very serious decline in the temperature, the extent of ice in the world. Now, last year there was a rebound in the Arctic sea ice, and this has gotten a lot of attention. Here we go. The change in total heat content since 1961, the amount of heat content of the oceans has increased by almost 250 times 10 to the 11 joules. In comparison to the land, the atmosphere, and the ice combined has been a heat increase of about 20. So we see a dramatic decline in ice worldwide. The Antarctica is losing over 100 billion tons of ice mass a year. Greenland is losing even more. It's astounding how much is being lost. The ice extent on the polar regions has been declining at a very consistent trend line. 2012 was a really bad year. It dropped to a level that was far, far below the trend line. 2013, it rebounded back up. And so it was about a 60% increase in the amount of ice. But of course, we started out with a very small amount of ice. When we looked at it, that 2013 increase actually only took it back to the level of 2009. Sea extent this year is tracking lower than the 2013 sea ice extent. So we don't see this rebound continuing.
All right, Dr. Timothy Ball, you've got 10 minutes. Go ahead, sir.
I've been studying climatology for almost 40 years, including my military time, studying and using meteorology. But my doctoral thesis was in reconstructing past climates, historical climate. And so I take issue with some of the things that Dr. Keating's saying. He's relying on NASA GISS. He mentioned, for example, the 9 years out of 10, the warmest, the most recent 10. It was disclosed in the last week that was incorrect information, that they had falsified the information, that in fact the 1930s was warmer. But NASA GISS has a history of that. James Hansen, who became the director of it, was chosen by Senator Gore and Worth to appear before their committee in 1988, at which he made the completely unsustainable scientific claim that he was 99% certain that humans were causing global warming. And, of course, following that, he was made the director of NASA GISS. They have been adjusting global temperature records around the world. But there's larger problems with what Dr. Keating is claiming because, yeah, he talks about the cycles. Our knowledge of those cycles is relatively limited. Well, I guess it's cherry picking because the reality is that we are in an interglacial. That is, over the last 420,000 years, there have been ice ages when massive ice sheets have formed on the land, and then interglacials when the world warms up markedly. And since the last ice age, global temperatures have increased about 12 degrees Celsius, and we are currently at the peak of that interglacial. The problem with saying that that's, significant is that it is not as warm as the previous three interglacials, which were at least 2 degrees Celsius warmer than at present. And then more recently, as that ice melted over the last 18,000 years, and most of it melted during a period called the Holocene Optimum, which starts about 10,000 years ago, or actually a little bit before that. For 10,000 years, the world was warmer than it is today. And we've got all sorts of evidence of that. I've got a photograph taken by Dr. Ritchie of a white spruce, fossilized, radiocarbon dated, 5,000 years old, and it's 100 kilometers north of the current tree line. So when we start to look at those long-term cycles, we see that what's going on today is well within that. And then not only that, but it's within the factor of error of those changes. Now, more recently, since that Holocene Optimum, that warm period, in the shorter record, the temperature fluctuates on about a 300-year cycle, and it was one of the things that the IPCC worked to get rid of. They literally rewrote the temperature record history with the so-called hockey stick. When they came out with their statements that it was warmer today than it had ever been, and that's implied in Dr. Keating's comments, we were pointing out, well, what about the medieval warm period? It was warmer around 1100 AD than it is today. There was a memo presented by Dr. David Deming at a Senate hearing that he got after he published an article in Science. He said he got an email from somebody who was using science, climate change for a political agenda, and in the email it said, we've got to get rid of the medieval warm period. They literally rewrote history in that hockey stick graph. That was what that 2001 IPCC report, which became the whole focus of the claim that humans were causing global warming. So the long-term record shows that everything that's happening today is well within natural variability. The evidence from leaked emails from the Climatic Research Unit at East Anglia, which was the major center of IPCC scientists, including Phil Jones, who produced the blade of the hockey stick, the increase of temperature over the last 120 years. And when you start looking at that, he said the temperature went up 0.6 degrees in 120 years, claimed that was outside of any natural increase of temperature, which is not true. But what was glossed over was the fact that it was 0.6 degrees plus or minus 0.2. which is actually a plus or minus 33% error. So the hockey stick, which became the focus of the proof of global warming, was completely falsified. For example, the handle of the stick, which covered almost 1,000 years, was done using tree rings, primarily one particular tree ring, which people were warned against using because of its unreliability, but they used it anyway. But tree rings don't represent temperature, they represent precipitation. And what happened was they were plotting the tree ring, and then suddenly in the 20th century, the temperatures, or what they were getting from their tree ring data, started to decline. Well, of course, that didn't fit with their agenda. So the computer models, when we got the coding of their computer models was released, they instructed the computer model to hide the decline. So take the tree ring data, which was showing the decline, and add on to that instrumental records produced by Phil Jones. Phil Jones, by the way, when he was asked to show that data, present that data for the blade of the hockey stick, first of all, he said, why should I show it to you? This was in an email to War Accused. He said, why should I show it to you when all you want to do is prove me wrong? Subsequently, when a Freedom of Information Act went to ask for the data, he'd lost the data. And that's all too common in what's gone on with the IPCC. IPCC was set up specifically to prove human cause of global warming.
No, IPCC, clarify for audience what that is, please.
Okay, the IPCC is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change that was created at the Rio Conference through the United Framework Convention on Climate Science. It was an agency set up through the UN, primarily through Maurice Strong. He set it up through the World Meteorological Organization, which of course meant that it was effectively controlled by the bureaucrats. And we've seen the problems just recently, as I said, with NOAA and their recent 10-year adjustment of the data. But here's the critical thing. Through the UNFCCC, the definition of climate change that was given to the IPCC scientists was a change of climate which is attributed directly or indirectly to human activity that alters the composition of the global atmosphere and which is in addition to natural climate variability observed over considerable time periods. But the problem is you can't possibly determine the human effect unless you know the amount and cause of natural climate change. So the definition they were given guaranteed that the focus would be upon human causes of climate change, and the focus was particularly on CO. They focused specifically on CO2. Now, there's part of the difficulty, because you talk to people and say, well, what are these greenhouse gases that the IPCC have identified? Well, 95% by volume is water vapor. They basically assume that's constant, and they assume that the amount that humans put into the atmosphere is of no significance. CO2 is barely 4% of the total greenhouse gases, yet it gets all of the attention. And when we look at the increases in CO2 in the atmosphere, which are put out by the IPCC, they're the ones that produce that data. But when you look at the carbon cycle of CO2 from natural sources, the range of errors in our knowledge about CO2 from natural sources, 3 of the natural sources' errors swamp the amount that they claim that humans are producing. So the answer is that this was a political agenda set out to prove that CO2 from humans was causing global warming. And on the basis of that, they want to shut down industry and shut down the economies of the world, and that's what's going on. It's a purely political agenda with political definitions. I also happen to know a great deal about water temperatures because I did anti-submarine work, and we were dropping thermometers into the ocean and discovering that there were multiple layers of water temperature as you went down. And, of course, that was important for sound transmission for tracking submarines. So the argument that we know anything of any significance from which we can draw conclusions about ocean water temperatures is simply nonsense.
Comments on that, Dr. Keating?
Everything he just said was false. We have very accurate data on the ocean temperature, and that data is online for anyone to go and see.
When you say where is that data, sir, online?
NOAA. NOAA is a very good place to get that information. NOAA, NOAA, National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration. One of the comments he made earlier was about ClimateGate. And let's be clear, 8 independent panels went and reviewed these leaked emails and the East Anglia group, and each independent group found that there was no kind of misconduct. One of the comments he made was about how the data continuously disappears. The data is 100% available for free to anyone with a computer from the National Climatic Data Center. You can log in and you can get all of the data. And so to come and make a claim that data disappears is a 100% lie. And this is the kind of information I talk about when I say deniers. They say this over and over.
First of all, Phil Jones himself said he had lost the data. That's reported by the BBC, which is very much in favor of the global warming argument. Jones himself said he'd lost the data, not me. Those studies that were done of the leaked emails have been shown to be totally controlled and manipulated, and I can send you all of the evidence of who was selected to serve on them, what data they were given, and how they reached the conclusions. They were complete whitewashes. And so to tell me that those cleared the whole CRU email evidence is in itself nonsense. Quote from another physicist and meteorologist, a German by the name of Klaus Eckhart Pulse. What Klaus Eckhart Pulse said was 10 years ago, I simply parroted what the IPCC told us. One day I started checking the facts and data. First I started with a sense of doubt, but then I became outraged when I discovered that much of what the IPCC and the media were telling us was sheer nonsense and was not even supported by any scientific facts and measurements. To this day, I still feel shame that as a scientist, I made presentations of their science without first checking it.
His argument has been, it's a non-science argument. And this is, when I made my challenge, this is why I made the requirement. It had to be a proof via the scientific
But, sir,
method.
You're also asserting something about the medieval warming period, but you're not talking about the fact that it is warmer on record in other times in history than it is now. So how would that be that humans were causing it back then?
All right, I'll answer both of these. Well, I already addressed the thing about the natural climate cycles, but to finish what I was saying, his only argument is there's this vast government conspiracy going throughout the entire scientific community of the entire world. And, if that's your argument, that is not science.
But, sir, you yourself have went on record saying that Al Gore is an idiot. And Al Gore is the very person that's been found funding some of these organizations. So you don't see any connection with this being, you're throwing out the word conspiracy, but you don't see any strange connections with all of this when you really step back and look at the broader issue of who's funding who and the fact that information is going missing or Phil Jones is ironically missing. I mean, do you find that ironic? Does your common sense think that there's something wrong with that, though?
No, when you start putting it together. Now, I heard about this German guy, and if it's the same German guy that I remember, they investigated it, and they came back and said that never happened. He had made it up.
When you said who was they that investigated it?
I can't remember all this, but I remember the story came out how he said he was told to lose the data, and when it was investigated, I want to say it was some news journal. So I can't pull out the exact data, but I remember a story like this before. When it was investigated, nothing could ever be produced to show that it actually happened.
Well, the BBC has information, sir, so you can't throw out statements like that. The BBC documented the statement in the email. So, I'm going to challenge you on that particular one.
Now, people do lose data. I've unfortunately lost my own data working in my research, and, you go back and, the way computers are. And
Sheila, let me speak
but
to
the fact of the matter is...
Okay, hold on. Just let him finish and then go ahead.
The matter is, the data that he was using is still available. The data did not disappear, even if he personally didn't have it available to him.
Okay, so you don't think that the hockey stick is a flawed conception?
No.
You're saying that you agree that's a great climate computer model.
Hockey stick has been proven to be valid through very many different studies. Was warmer than it is today is also not true. That is very well documented. The hottest period in history for the last 10,000 years is right now.
No, that's simply not true. Look,
that is absolutely true.
Okay, hold on. Let Mr. Ball rebuttal this, please, sir.
Okay, let me go to the physics of it. First of all, you would agree that water vapor is a far more important greenhouse gas than CO2, and yet all of the focus is on CO2.
Because if you didn't have CO2 warming up the atmosphere in the first place, there wouldn't be additional water vapor in the air. The reason the water vapor is there is because something heated up the atmosphere in the first place.
No, that's not correct.
That is absolutely true. Water vapor will not
false.
spontaneously heat the atmosphere.
Here's what's wrong with that. It's that in every record we've got, including the ice core record, and I remember when it came out in 1991, Pettit and Giles and all that, said, oh, there it is, the temperature's going up and down, the CO2's going up and down. We found out within 5 years that the temperature was changing before the CO2. And,
that's correct.
And so, okay, now, that's true in every single record, but what you're telling us is...
Except for the present one.
Oh, okay. So every single record that we have of any duration, of any time period, the temperature increases before the CO2. But the fundamental assumption is that CO2 increase causes temperature increase. That doesn't occur. The only place that I know of in the world a CO2 increase precedes a temperature increase is in the computer models of the IPCC. But what is not in the computer models of the IPCC are the Milankovitch cycle, the cycles of orbital changes, tilt changes of the Earth. Those are not in the IPCC computer models, yet you're talking about cycles and how important they are. The relationship between amount of cosmic radiation and low cloud, which has been in the literature since 1991, now known as the Svensmark theory, that is not in their computer models. And the final killer of the argument that the science of the IPCC is good is that every single prediction they have made has been wrong. They don't call them predictions anymore because by 1995, even by their second report, their predictions were so wrong that people were laughing at them. And so they started calling them projections. Even their projections are wrong. And you know, Mr. Keating, that if your prediction is wrong, your science is wrong, period. But they didn't go back and check their science. What they did was they changed the names. They went from global warming to climate change. And that occurred because they had the problem that Huxley identified. The great bane of hypothesis is an ugly fact, because from 2000 on, global temperatures leveled off and declined while CO2 levels continued to increase.
Okay, so again, you've proven why I object to all this, because you're getting on the public stage and you're saying all of these falsehoods. So let's go back to the climate record. You said it yourself. The temperature increases before the CO2. And so in the natural cycles, something has happened to start warming. Typically, it is we have found a very high correlation between solar activity and this warming. As the solar activity goes up, the temperature goes up. As the solar activity goes down, the temperature goes down. And this is not a precede or follow-up. It is very much in step. So all of the natural cycles, what we see is the solar activity goes up, and shortly after that, the CO2 goes up, and it becomes a driver for additional greenhouse gases. This is true, as far as I know, in every single cycle except for one, the one that we're in right now. The solar activity is dropping. In fact, it's dropping so much that deniers are saying that we need to worry about a mini ice age instead of global warming. And so the solar activity is going down. The temperature, the CO2 level is going up, and it's preceding the temperature. It is not following the temperature change. It is preceding the temperature change. And so what we see here is that the current trend is completely different than all of these natural cycles that you keep citing. Now, you talked about Milankovitch. Why is Milankovitch cycles not included? They are. Problem is, a Milankovitch cycle is 100,000 years long. A 10-year, 20-year, 50-year trend is not going to be affected by something that takes 100,000 years. Cosmic rays are most definitely included in all of the IPCC models. They are a significant contributor to cloud formation. So anything that includes cloud formation includes cosmic rays. Then you said all of these models have been wrong, and that is a falsehood also. In fact, they have a 95% accuracy rate. They even have models that predicted the current surface temperature cooling pause. That was, in fact, predicted by some of these climate models. And so when you come out and you say that they are 100% false, again, you are not telling the truth. You are deliberately misleading people with falsehoods. If someone wants to reject global warming, that's their business. But they have a right to make the decision in an informed manner. And global warming deniers are denying them that ability by feeding them false information. And that is what you've been doing on this show.
First of all, it was a major contributor to the IPCC computer models by the name of Andrew Weaver, who told me that Milankovitch cycles were not included in IPCC models. Okay? You've just misled people because you said the Milankovitch cycle is 100,000 years. That only applies to one portion of the Milankovitch cycles or effect. It's called the Milankovitch effect. The 100,000-year cycle relates to changing orbit of the Earth around the Sun, and it goes through a complete cycle from extreme ellipse to circular, almost circular as it is now, and back to extreme ellipse again in 100,000 years. So it's actually the 100,000 years is a full cycle, and in fact the effects are half cycles. The second part of it is that the tilt of the Earth is a 40,000-year cycle, and that is part of the Milankovitch effect. And the third part is the precession of the equinoxes. All of those together cause changes in the amount of energy reaching the Earth, and so it isn't 100,000 years. And so when you add in all of those effects together, and James Kroll was calculating this 150 years ago, it has an impact upon the temperature of the Earth. And yes, in 50 and 100 years, it is a significant factor. And I would argue that the amount of the Milankovitch effect in that time certainly is equal to any possible effect of human CO2 in the model.
Well, the precession of the equinoxes and the rotation, the precession of the rotation axes are not part of the Milankovitch cycles.
That's
Milankovitch cycle is the Milankovitch cycle concerns the change in the shape of the Earth's orbit.
No, that's
precession,
one part.
The precession
that's
of the equinoxes and I'm sorry, but those do not change the orbit. And so
I didn't say they did. They changed the climate, though.
No, you said that they are part of the Milankovitch cycles.
No,
now,
the effect. Milankovitch effect is the combination of the three.
The Earth precesses at a rate of 41,000 years. And so that's what causes the precession of the equinoxes. What happens in 50 years is insignificant compared to those time spans. You can't go and say that something that takes tens of thousands of years is going to make a dramatic difference in 10 years, which is exactly what we saw from 1980 to 1990, not to mention the longer time scale of late 70s to the present. Those time scales are so small compared to the time scales you're talking about, then it is safe to say that those were not responsible for the rapid change that we saw. And the change that we have seen in this current warming trend is faster than anything ever observed in the climate history going back 800,000 years.
That's simply incorrect. Your comment about the Milankovitch effect is completely false. It isn't just the orbital eccentricity. It's also the tilt and the precession combined. You combine the three effects to get the net effect of those three things. And so it is significant. And not only that, but it's only one of the things that are left out of the computer models, only one small part of it. And you mentioned about the cosmic rays. We didn't know until Milankovitch. In fact, they kept holding off on the confirmation that cosmic rays were creating condensation nuclei and causing cloud in the lower atmosphere. The CERN observatory were doing the studies on it, and they kept delaying release of the information on that because I know from my research that we had known for a long time there were not enough condensation nuclei to explain the amount of cloud cover that we had. Well, the cosmic rays coming into the atmosphere, and the amount of them is moderated by changes in the solar magnetic field, which are correlated and manifest with sunspot numbers. We suddenly have an explanation for why there's more cloud cover than there are condensation nuclei in the atmosphere. So everywhere that you look, the things that they've left out of their IPCC models, each bit accumulates to make the models absolutely meaningless. And they have been wrong in every single forecast they've made. And as I said, they changed from making predictions and started calling them projections precisely because they were not working.
Brian Tinsley was publishing on the cosmic rays creating cloud nuclei as early as 1990. He was publishing, he was presenting. Very highly respected professor of physics.
I know Brian Tinsley.
So you can't come out and say that it did not start with CERN. It's been out there over 20 years.
You're completely misquoting me. I didn't say it started with CERN. I said that CERN was used to confirm that the cosmic rays could create a condensation nuclei. That was the critical part.
When did this business about cosmic rays start? Let's be specific in the calculations of formation of clouds. Brian Tinsley had shown this to be true in the early 90s.
No, I know Tinsley and I know his work. Tinsley was not showing that. It was Christensen.
I'm sorry, but I sat there right with Brian, and I didn't believe it. And he went through the science, and he showed me, and he convinced me.
Okay, well, so he convinced you, but it didn't get into the literature.
You can't tell me that Brian wasn't doing it in the early 1990s.
I didn't tell you that. I said it didn't get into the literature, and it isn't in the computer models.
It is in the literature, and he presented it at conferences.
But it wasn't part of the total discussion about causes of climate change. And it wasn't until Christensen...
It is included in cloud formation models and has been for a long time. Cloud formation models are then included into the bigger models.
Here, I'm going to step in. So the argument, though, is that man is causing global warming. I want you to make your points on why you're so sure about that, Mr. Kading.
I'm sure for two reasons, and we just saw the reason. One of the big reasons. Number one, the science is overwhelming. There is irrefutable science that shows this is going on. And the other reason I'm so sure is demonstrated by Mr. Ball himself. His argument against man-made global warming is that there is this grand conspiracy. That is his primary piece of evidence. It is all false because someone else is coming out here and has a vested interest and somehow has gone and gotten the entire climatic science community of the entire world to
Okay, sir, I'm going to throw this in there, though,
this
because that is a leap, because Al Gore has been on record now as now you know that Al Gore is being sued for his Inconvenient Truth. There was 9 major errors in that movie. So would you agree with that? I'm going to start asking if you disagree or agree. Would you agree that movie
absolutely
is
agree.
a big
and
hoax?
when that movie came out, I was very critical of the movie, and people said, well, you're a climate change denier. And I said, no, the reason I don't like it is because there's errors in that movie, and now people are going to come and pull this movie out as evidence that climate change isn't real.
But you cannot deny the fact that Al Gore and James Hansen were doing things for a political reason. So it's not exactly fair for you to throw out the word political when that's what we're seeing as a deliberate corruption of climate science for a political purpose. That is on record, sir.
If you want to say that Al Gore was doing it for politics, that's fine. But let's go back to the record. James Hansen was condemned and ostracized by the Bush administration for 8 years for his stand on climate change. So that kind of goes against what you're saying, that he was doing this just to further his political career. And James Hansen came out and he made models back in the early 1980s and predictions that have been accurate all the way up to today.
That's simply false. But I'm going to contradict your comment about Hansen because I spoke to his boss. And the argument that the Bush administration was interfering came from Hansen himself. His boss told me there was no such evidence, no interference whatsoever. And not only that, but after Hansen retired, 26 NASA scientists came out and said that they disagreed with what Hansen was saying and what Hansen was doing. So, but your comment about me taking a political point of view, the point I'm trying to make to you, sir, is that all of the evidence points to the narrowing of science by a small group of scientists in order to prove that human CO2 was causing global warming. That's what they set out to prove. That's what they achieved through their computer models in the IPCC.
6,000 emails were leaked out of East Anglia. That is undeniable. That's irrefutable now, and that's on record.
That is unrefutable. Wait a minute. They were not leaked. Let's be clear. They were illegally
Sir,
hacked.
does it matter if they came out or they were leaked? We're just splitting hairs here, really. They came out.
They came out. They
came out.
Wait a minute. They took those 6,000 emails, and they selectively went in and picked out the ones that they wanted, and then they massaged those emails. They picked specific quotes out of context. They even took quotes and took words out of the quote in order to make it sound the way they wanted it to sound.
Let me ask you this, sir. You have no concerns about the credibility of the UN's Little Climate Action Group. You have no issues with this group at all?
Oh, of course I do. And I'm very happy with the way they go about doing their work. They take these work, they have a large panel, and then they put all of their work out there for everyone in the world to see. Not just the scientists, not just their panels. They put it out for comment for the entire world. The definition of transparency.
Have you looked at their most recent report? Going on record with you have no concerns with that report.
There's so many thousands of pages in that thing. I can't come out and vouch for every single page.
But you're vouching for them on air right now.
I'm vouching for the procedure that they're using to go and have transparency, view them, or comment on them.
But here's the question. One of the things that they set up when they set up the IPCC was they set up the 3 working groups. Working group 1 was the physical science basis, okay? They produced their report. It's set aside. Their data is taken by Working Group 2, which look at the impact. Working Group 3 look at the mitigation procedures. After all of that is done, that's set aside. Then a summary for policymakers is written by a completely different group. And I urge anybody to go and look at the differences between the summary for policymakers, which goes to the public, and the work and the physical science of Working Group 1. They are so vastly different that it's unbelievable. It's done because they know that most people will not read the Working Group 1 report, and not only that, but most that do read it won't understand it. And so that was part of the strategy that Dr. Keating's talking about. What goes to the public, and it's what Krauss Eckhart Pulse was talking about when he said that what the IPCC and the media were telling us was sheer nonsense. So there's a vast difference between the physical science report that they do that, by the way, identifies all of the severe limitations of what they're doing.
Let me get this straight. Just a few minutes ago, you were very critical, and you said part of the evidence of this grand conspiracy was the fact that they wouldn't produce the evidence. They wouldn't produce the data. And now when they're putting the data out for everyone to see it, you're saying that is also evidence for a conspiracy.
That's not what I said, sir. What I said was that
it's what
I said. No, that's how you interpreted it. That's not what I said.
And this is the problem when you make a non-scientific argument.
I suggest you read my book about the deliberate corruption of climate science, and you'll see how that happened. What was the motive? And it goes back to a need to identify CO2 as the byproduct of fossil fuels and fossil industry and industries driven by fossil fuels, because the Club of Rome wanted to shut down the industrialized nations.
You're saying that these people want to send the world into, they go and say the governments in the world are in a grand conspiracy to throw the world economy into a tailspin. That is most definitely refutable.
You do not believe that Maurice Strong is quoted as saying, isn't it their job to deindustrialize the entire United States of America? You don't agree with that quote. You don't agree with the fact that he said in Searching for a New Enemy, we need to come up with the idea that global warming is a threat and therefore man is the culprit of it. You're saying that he didn't say those things.
I have not, until I see the quote and see what it says in context, I don't want to comment on it. But I will comment on the idea that the world governments are in a grand conspiracy to destroy the world economy.
How many countries are involved in the IPCC?
Off the top of my head, I can't remember. It is a large number.
Virtually all of them. Okay, but it's not the politicians that are involved. It's the weather agencies in every country. They are members of the IPCC, and they are the ones that are supporting the IPCC. They're the ones that are telling the politicians what policy they've got to pursue. That's what Hagmann was doing.
Why are they doing this?
I think that to many of them, because it's their job. But I'm telling you, sir, that most people are silent because it's their job. I've given hundreds of presentations where government workers have come up to me and said, we agree with you, but it's worth our job to say anything.
So your argument that there's no man-made global warming is because there's people who won't come forward and say so.
You completely created a straw man there. I didn't say that. What I said was far too many people are afraid to say anything.
And this is so bizarre. This is so bizarre. We couldn't even keep secret that the NSA is spying on people's cell phones. How in the world are we going to keep a conspiracy like this secret?
Mr. Keating, how can you say a conspiracy like this secret? You just mentioned the government spying on people. Why would the government be spying on us? That sounds like a conspiracy theory. You see where I'm going with this.
You still haven't answered my question, which is the real measure of science, is why, if their science is so correct, are their predictions consistently wrong?
They aren't. And the data is out there. It's a nice report in The Guardian. Lo and behold, you've been talking about the Guardian. Global warming predictions prove accurate. Let's see.
No, I said the BBC. I didn't say The Guardian.
Nobody said The Guardian. That's George Monbiot, and he was communicating with the people at the CRU as the release email showed.
Here's the Union of Concerned Scientists, accurate or existing computer climate modeling techniques. And this is written as recently as December 2013. And they come in and they talk about how accurate they are.
Okay, so you have no issue with this hockey stick model then, Mr. Keating. That's what you're saying.
No. Let's be clear about science data. Science data you see some changes in these things over a period of time. That isn't because we're doctoring the data. That's because we're getting better at finding the errors in these things and making them more accurate. Now, we've done a number of people have gone through and done this same study of the temperature over a period of time, and the hockey stick keeps showing up over and over. And it's not just Michael Mann doing it by himself. There's a number of different groups have done it with different databases, and they keep getting the hockey stick. And so am I comfortable with the hockey stick? I am very comfortable. If you want to come and ask me, are you comfortable with this specific piece of data at this specific point in time? I said, well, it might change as
so you agree that CO2 is the strongest driver of climate change compared to other changes in the atmospheric composition then?
That's correct. Although, now let's be clear, it is not the biggest greenhouse gas by volume in the atmosphere. Water vapor is the number one in terms of volume. CO2 is the driver. CO2 is the reason why water vapor keeps going up. It's going on right now, and make any kind of prediction about when that's going to change or where it's going to go.
It's on record that IPCC projections are wrong, sir, though. That is absolutely irrefutable, though.
Define wrong.
Wrong as in not correct.
If I say 2 plus 2 is equal to 5, that's wrong. If I say 2 plus 2 is 4.00000001, I'm still wrong. But do you see the trend going on here?
But that, sir, depends upon whether you're using discrete or continuous numbers. Let me go back to your point about CO2 being the driver. That's the argument that CO2 is a positive feedback. And it came up because of what I call the black paint problem. You see, people pointed out that the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere is virtually at saturation. In other words, if it has an effect of retaining heat escaping from the Earth, then it's almost at the maximum amount. And I use the black paint argument because it's like if you want to block light going through a window, you put one coat of paint on, it blocks virtually all the light. A second coat has very little effect. And so the problem came for the IPCC. They said, well, even if you double or triple CO2 in the atmosphere, the increase in temperature is decreasing dramatically, in fact. And so they had a problem. So what did they do? They came out and said, oh, well, the CO2 will cause an increase in temperature. The temperature will increase the evaporation, and the water vapor, therefore, will be a positive feedback on the CO2 increase. That has been shown to be wrong.
The extinction distance of CO2 in the atmosphere is a few hundred feet. And so if I have a infrared source here and I have a CO2 atmosphere and atmosphere with CO2 in it, that infrared radiation will only go a few hundred feet. And if I go and I put more CO2 into that 300 feet, it still will not go any farther than that. That's called an extinction distance. The problem with your analogy is this. That black paint on the window does not become an emitter of light. CO2, once it absorbs infrared radiation, then becomes an emitter of that infrared radiation. And so if a photon of light goes 300 feet through the atmosphere, gets absorbed by a CO2 molecule, that molecule will then emit that IR photon, and it can now go another 300 feet. And so doubling the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere does, in fact, change the amount of heat that the CO2 can store in the atmosphere. Now, the ironic thing about this is that one of the big claims that deniers make is that the level of CO2 in the past was higher and the temperature was higher, and so that proves that today's global warming is not dangerous. And so on one hand, you're saying
no, I've never seen that argument at all.
CO2 is not a problem. It's not proof. But on the other hand, your deniers are using this as evidence that we don't need to worry about it.
No, I've never seen that argument made at all, sir. But,
I see it all the time.
I'm sure you do, because you see what you're looking for. But here's the point. The IPCC assume that CO2 is uniformly distributed through the atmosphere, not concentrated.
And that's a simple model. In fact, in the troposphere, that is a pretty good model in the troposphere.
No, it isn't, because you just said that the greatest concentration is in the first 300 meters. You've just contradicted yourself.
No, that's not what I said. I said an IR photon can go through up to about roughly 300 meters for the extinction distance. And that is horizontal. That's going up. That's going down. It doesn't matter which direction you go. That IR photon cannot go more than 300 meters without being absorbed by a CO2 molecule. But then once that CO2 molecule absorbs that infrared photon, it will then turn around and re-emit it, and it will re-emit it in a random direction.
In all directions.
So it then has up to another 300 meters.
It radiates in all directions, and 50% of that is up. But then what you're saying...
50% of it is back down towards the surface.
So that's the back radiation that they talk about in the models. Back radiation simply doesn't exist.
It most definitely does. So that back radiation is not only very, very real, but it's very, very easy to prove it's real.
We can debate about that as well.
I'd like to see a single physicist come back and say that CO2 does not radiate in all directions. You're saying CO2 is a laser.
That's not what I said at all.
You said it doesn't radiate back down.
I asked you
just said back radiation does not exist. I'm a physicist, and I'm telling you that a CO2 molecule will re-radiate that infrared photon.
That's your position. But
that is not my position. That is a science fact. And see, that's the problem here. The deniers, when they come across science they don't like, they simply reject it. I have the science to back me up. And your argument is it's a grand government conspiracy to destroy the world economy.
No, what I said was, what my problem was that the correlation between CO2 and temperature didn't relate, and I wanted an explanation for that. So is it thermal radiation, or is it what sort of radiation?
It is thermal radiation. It is infrared. So CO2 molecules will absorb photons of infrared energy, and they will re-emit it, and they can do this
is that
thousands,
energy?
if not millions of times per second.
Is that heat, or is that energy?
It is light. It is infrared light. It is an electromagnetic wave. Infrared is an electromagnetic wave. It's just like the light that we see with our eyes, except that it is a longer wavelength. And we know this nowadays. I'm sure we've all seen the infrared detectors on TVs and movies and stuff, where they can go and pick up the infrared light. CO2 absorbs the Earth radiates this infrared light as it gets warmed up by the sun's wavelengths, short waves. And so now it re-emits this long wavelength of infrared light. That infrared light is radiating up to space. If there is no atmosphere, it would just go shooting out into space. The CO2 in the atmosphere and other greenhouse gases will go and absorb that infrared light. CO2 in particular will then go and re-emit that photon of light very, very quickly, and it will do it in a random direction. And so if you have a large number of molecules, what this means is that photons by the CO2 atmosphere is being radiated in all directions. Some of it is going upwards, and some of it is going downwards.
As I said, I'm not going to argue the physics with you. You're the physicist. All I'm telling you is I'm glad to have this on record, what you're saying, because I'm getting other physicists telling me very different things. That's my issue.
Oh boy, I'll be glad to debate it with anyone that wants to refute that.
All right, then I will arrange that. But here's the thing. When I look at the sum total of what is being said and what the computer models are doing, it doesn't add up. It simply doesn't add up. I'm very pleased to have you on record of saying that the hockey stick is good science, because that is absolutely stunning.
The only people that have a problem with the hockey stick are the deniers, because, of course, it shows exactly what they want to deny is happening. I think that the evidence is overwhelming. The scientific evidence is overwhelming that global warming is occurring and that it is caused by man-made emissions. Dr. Ball's arguments have been mostly characterizing government actions and questioning motives. And let's be clear, what do climate scientists have to gain by saying that there's global warming? Climate scientists get paid to research the climate. And there's going to be climate whether there's global warming or not. Climate scientists research the climate. And there's going to be climate whether there's climate change or not.
The term conspiracy theory has been thrown out there, and I prefer to think that science is all about skepticism. When the IPCC set up the hypothesis that anthropogenic global warming, they said that the CO2 increase would cause warming, and CO2 would increase because humans were producing more of it every year. And they then set about to prove that hypothesis when the proper scientific method is to disprove it. And as Richard Lindzen, an atmospheric physicist from MIT, said many years ago, that the consensus was reached before the research had even begun. And what I've observed over the 30 years I've been studying climate from an academic point of view is that every time a piece of evidence came out, there would be an attack either on the individual or there would be an argument that later proved to be false. So, for example, when we came out and said, well, look, the Holocene optimum was warmer than today, they said, oh, well, it was only warmer in the summertime. It wasn't warmer in the winter. And then the medieval warm period, and they came out with the hockey stick to get rid of it. They not only got rid of the medieval warm period through the hockey stick, but John Holden, who was at Harvard, and this is all in those emails, they viciously attacked Willie Soon and Sally Baliunas, two astronomers from Lamont Doherty, who had documented the existence of the medieval warm period from a wide variety of sources, to the point where Sally just gave up. She just quit. She said, this is not science anymore. And so what has gone on here is that they've set up an IPCC to prove something, and then instead of allowing proper skepticism to occur, they attack the people that dare to ask questions. And they did it by terms like conspiracy theory or global warming skeptic, when I never was a skeptic about global warming. I was a skeptic about what they were arguing was the cause. And then they switched to climate change when it didn't fit anymore, and I became a climate change denier. I am anything but a denier. I have spent my whole career arguing how much climate changes, how short time periods, and how much it changes in short time periods. And so the argument that I saw that the warming over the last 120 years from the blade of the hockey stick was more than had ever occurred before, I knew that was not correct because I'd reconstructed long-term temperature records over time. So what's gone on here is, unfortunately, the total abuse of science, but particularly climate science, for a political agenda. And as I said, the projections are failing, the recommended solutions are failing, and people are suffering because of what has gone on.
Well, I certainly don't think this issue is totally debated, of course. Perhaps we can have another debate at some point in the near future. I really appreciate both Dr. Tim Ball and Dr. Christopher Keating. Thank you so much for being on the show today. It was a great debate. Like I said, the discussion, I'm sure, is not over. Perhaps, like I said, we can have a second debate at some point in the future. Thank you so much, gentlemen.
Broadcasting to the world It's the Weekend Reports with Hagmann and Hagmann and the Weekend Vigilante.
Well, folks, welcome back to the final hour of the Weekend Report. As you heard Dr. Ball and Dr. Keating debate, we heard the fact that Dr. Tim is indeed a climate denier and a conspiracy theorist, and the government is in a grand conspiracy. So you're not allowed to talk about the corrupt UN or the globalists or their nefarious agenda. I guess that's what we learned from that. Folks who want to hear from you, the call-in number to the studios is 661-244-9839. Press 1 to get into the studio queue. Weigh in on the debate, weigh in on global warming and climate change. We are opening up the phone lines wide open. Tim, the part I had a hard time containing my laughter is his audacity to say, and on record, the hockey stick, that's a great climate instrument. And I love when you said, I'm glad we have this on record. You have no problems with it. That's stunning. I was stunned when he said that. But then his whole argument was based on Phil Jones, James Hansen, and the NOAA, which is in bed with NASA and the UN. And we can agree that he's out to lunch on the Milankovitch effects. They're not included in the IPC models. There's a lot of problems with the models. The only people, he said, that have a problem with the hockey stick is the deniers. What surprised you the most about the debate, and what things stuck out to you, Tim?
Well, I think there's two things. One is, of course, that the argument about the hockey stick. He clearly doesn't understand the degree to which it has been exposed, and in fact, in the following IPCC report, the 2007 report, because the hockey stick came out in the 2001 report, it wasn't even included. So they themselves dropped it. And of course, man is continuing to refuse to disclose the statistical methods and the coding that he used in order to create it.
Well, it's funny because he says, there's a lot of things I actually found really interesting, but one of the things he said that, hey, the government's spying on us, I thought, wait a minute, that sounds like a conspiracy theory. We have a wall of calls here, Tim, so we're going to jump into some calls. And
sure.
I just want to encourage people, again, the number is 661-244-9839. Weigh in on the debate. I mean, of course, it was a frustrating debate because, he has this theory and he's going by data and basically proved that this data is not correct. Well, the very organizations that pump out this data, is very, it's very problematic. We're going to go to 952. Welcome to the Weekend Report. What's on your mind?
Hey, I'm just listening to this, and I'm thinking, one word, HARP, and how can we trust any of the data at all, because you got 72 HARP ionic heaters that supercharge and heat up the atmosphere, and I think it's just all a bunch of BS with a capital Bravo Sierra, like Quayle would say.
Yeah, I think that they call it the age of information, but Michael Crichton, who was a medical doctor, graduate of Harvard, and also, of course, the writer of those superb books, he called it the age of misinformation. And the problem is that government effectively control all data, and they manipulate it and create it in the way that they want. And so, I couldn't agree with you more.
Absolutely agree with that caller. Well, we've got, like I said, a wall of calls. 505, welcome to the Weekend Report. What's your comment?
Hi, a couple of comments. One, I have done research both in academia and in private industry, and I'll tell you the ethics in academic research are almost non-existent. When somebody comes in with a pile of money, the conclusion that they want, and if you give them the answer that they want, you continue to get dollars, and if you don't, you don't. I'll give you an example. This happened a number of years ago with an Arizona State University climate researcher. He found a homeostatic mechanism whereby, and this is not my area of expertise, so I'm taking this for granted, but he found a homeostatic mechanism whereby if the oceans heated, there would be more plankton, and the plankton put off a sulfur compound that actually counteracts global warming and produces cooling. Anybody who has ever studied, heat and mass transfer would immediately recognize that the complexities involved in an atmospheric model are beyond our solution. And one final comment, in every area of science there is something called the homeostatic principle, and that is if you perturb nature in one direction, there is always a mechanism present that tends to return it to equilibrium.
Caller, those are superb points, and of course the key two things. One is that when they were studying the climate, the global warming particularly, they narrowed the definition to only human causes. And of course, as I've constantly said, you can't possibly identify human effects, if there are any, if you don't understand the natural variability. The other point you make about homeostasis is that although the climate varies quite considerably over long periods of time and relatively quickly in short periods of time, it's surprisingly stable because of exactly what you're describing. I think that the article you were referring to was part of what came out related to the Gaia hypothesis, and the Gaia hypothesis was arguing that the plants in fact create the environment that they want, that they're in control, which of course is the exact opposite of what was traditional thinking. But to your other point, your first point about academia and academics, I watched that change occur. It used to be, of course, that academics would do a lot of things nefariously in order to advance their career from an academic point of view, an intellectual point of view. I think the Piltdown hoax, where an anthropologist was so determined to find the missing link that his colleagues made fun of him by creating a chimpanzee with chimpanzee skull with a human jawbone or something like that anyway, and they planted it knowing he would find it, and of course he was so blinded by his obsession of academic achievement that he completely fell for it. But one of the things that I saw change and occur during my period in university was the shift to more and more government funding of universities. Now, the private universities tended to be a little bit above that, but gradually the government money and the money coming in became more and more important. It used to be, as you know, the dictum was publish or perish. But what it changed to was bring in funding and publish or perish. And part of that came about, I can't talk about all countries in the world, but I certainly know the ones I've looked at. Universities were short of funds. They didn't want to, enrollment was dropping. They didn't want to increase tuition fees too much. And they discovered that if a faculty member was getting research funding, they could scrape 35, even 40% or more off the top of it on what sounded like reasonable grounds that, they were providing space and heat and electricity and all the rest of it. And so a faculty member became more valuable to the university on the basis of the amount of funding that they were bringing in. And this is one of the issues in the climate debate, because when you look at the people at East Anglia who were cooking the books there and cheating, they were Jones, the head of it, was bringing in $20 million himself. And of course, the university then see a faculty member in terms of the amount of money they can bring in, not necessarily the value of the work that they're doing. So these are all trends that have gone on, which you very correctly identified.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we're going to go to another caller. Thank you for that, caller. That was very, very astute. Area code 304, welcome to the Weekend Report. What is your comment? Area code 304, you're live.
Hi, Sheila and Doctor. I didn't get it on all the show, but isn't government like the worst purveyor of everything? They make more pollution. They do worse things to the planet than anything.
Well, do you know that Al Gore actually has the biggest climate footprint than any person on planet Earth, ironically?
Yeah, well, and of course, what's scary about Gore is he was within 1,500 votes of being the president. But beyond all of that, I speak to the point that the caller is making. Yes, governments are the most inefficient, the least accountable, the most defensive. And what happens is that an issue is raised, and people say, "Oh, we need to do something about this." The governments grab it, and the politicians particularly, if they see if by dealing with it they can get more votes, they then turn it over to a government department, and that almost by default guarantees that you're not going to solve the problem. Yeah. Because the first thing they start doing is defining the problem, and if they solve the problem, then they're effectively putting themselves out of work. It's like I used to tease the sociologists at the university. I said, if you guys were any good at your work, you'd be out of a job by now. But more than that, government not only don't attempt to resolve the issue, they attempt to perpetuate it and expand it. And of course, that's why governments consistently grow. And as Mary McCarthy said, the problem in today's society with government is the bureaucracy, the rule of no one, the modern form of despotism. And of course, what happened with the climate issue was that's why when they set it up, they did it through the World Meteorological Organization, which involved the government weather agencies in every country in the world. And it gave them control of the bureaucracy, and they then controlled the politician, because they would come along and say, well, you've got to do this, and the politician would say, well, hang on a minute, and then they would say, well, we're the experts. We know all about this. How dare you question us? So, yeah, I mean, government, but it isn't just government. Government is the worst example of everything, but it's with anything. You know, Lord Acton said power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And what I've noticed is, and what we've got to start doing, is the minute that you give power, you've got to start whittling it away and taking it away. That was what the Founding Fathers were all about. Limit the government, have one branch watching and limiting the other. And, of course, that's what Obama's starting to get around. But, as I said, it isn't just government. It's the nature of people. And so I've tried to practice this all my career. For example, we had a president of the university who was playing one faculty member off against another and writing individual contracts with each. Well, we found out the only solution that we could to get control was to form a union. And we had to get registered and so on, and I worked hard to do that. And we got a first contract, and everything was made much more equitable and fair and based on merit and so on and performance. But within 2 weeks of being the secretary of forming that union, I quit the union and started to form a group to get rid of the union for precisely the reasons I've just finished talking about. And so what we've got to do is set up a system whereby anything we set up, we put limits on it, we put controls on it, we keep an eye on it to stop it growing unnecessarily and by its own force. And that's really the issue that we're confronted with here. Hello, Sheila.
Hello?
Hello.
All right. I got a few comments and questions.
Yeah, go ahead.
First of all,
we've lost Sheila. Yeah,
no,
we've lost
I'm here.
Sheila,
sorry, Area Code 402. Welcome to the program.
No, we could. Yeah.
I'm getting booted out of the studio already, so.
It's okay.
Sorry, Area Code 402. Welcome.
Yeah. All right. Hey, listen, I got some questions and I got some observations I'd like to make. First of all, if you look at the history of the world, the ice has been melting all the way on our planet ever since the ice age ended. Also, it used to be tropical. I'm here in Nebraska. We have fossils of tropical plants, animals that were, prehistoric. Obviously, they did not fur-bearing animals. But also, does the climate people take into account for all the underwater volcanoes that are active, all the methane gas in the polar north? And I'm throwing a lot of things out here. What about the earthquakes in Fukushima, which actually made the Earth's rotation change? Polar north is moving, at like something less than a half a degree or less per year, and it's changing our Earth's axis which faces the sun, and all those things. Do they not take any of that into account?
Individual disciplines, and this is one of the problems, to speak to your the general context of your question, the world is, we've got so much information now that the world is divided into individual specializations, and the way I like to describe it is that all of these academic experts are so specialized, and they've each got their piece of the puzzle, but we've lost the box top. And so the guy that I debated with, for example, if he was truly studying climate, and an earlier caller said it's an incredibly complex system, every bit of it adding or subtracting little bits, which is inferred in your question. And so, for example, with CO2, we don't really know how much humans are adding, partly because it's government that are giving the figures, but we certainly don't know the range of variability of CO2 from natural sources added every year. And methane came up a while ago, methane coming off the permafrost, off the bottom of the oceans, and all these other things. Yeah, the amount of data that is not included really makes a mockery of the whole claim that they're 95% certain about their climate science and their predictions. So I think that you absolutely hit a nail on the head with that. By the way, just a quick comment about your reference to the fossils in your region. You have to be very careful, and it's a perfect example of the sort of thing that further emphasizes the second point you made. You can go to the Arctic, as I have, and you can find cliffs of coral on Baffin Island, for example. But what people have to realize is that the continents are moving around. And so that coral wasn't formed in the Arctic. It was formed when Baffin Island was in the tropical waters close to the equator. It's the land masses that have moved. And so once you start taking continental drift into account, and where was the land mass when those particular fossils were created and laid down, then you start to get an understanding of what's happening. But that's just another part of the dynamics, as I said, that speaks to your second observation.
Okay.
Do you have any other comment, 402?
Yeah.
No, that was it. I mean, they don't ever take, like they keep saying the Earth's oceans are rising, and like I think it was 1997, we had in Reykjavik, Iceland, the underwater volcanoes were erupting, and it literally covered land masses with water to the point where they were worried about calling a state of emergency.
Yeah. Well,
they never take those things into account.
No, they don't. They don't, because you see, sea level isn't level. And it varies up to as much as 100 feet, based upon the gravitational pull within the Earth and the various densities of the rock underneath, and also the level of the ocean is determined by the weight of the atmosphere sitting on it. That's why when you get a hurricane with very low atmospheric pressure, the sea level rises up, and that's like a massive, very long wave. And if it moves up on shore, that's a major part of what causes the storm surge associated with a hurricane. If you go through the Panama Canal, the ocean is different level on the Atlantic and Pacific sides, and yet people can't believe that. But so, yeah, every single thing you look at, it really, you have to understand. Another factor, they've been pointing at the Gulf of Mexico and saying, oh, look, the sea level's rising, look at the influx of the ocean along the Gulf Coast. Well, what's happening there is the land is sinking. And, of course, you need to know, if you're on a shore, is the water rising or is the land sinking? And along the Gulf of Mexico, the land is sinking and the water appears to be rising. But in Hudson Bay, the land is rising and the water level is going down. And so, as I said, the complexity of these things, to make the simplistic statements they do and to scare people to death with completely unjustified arguments is really it's almost like shouting fire in a crowded theater. It's that wrong.
Well, brilliant comments and great questions by our listener, only further proving we have the best audience in the world. Folks, again, the call-in number is 661. I just want to give everybody the call-in number again, 661-244-9839. We're going to go to area code 603. Welcome to the Weekend Report. What's your comment? Area code 603, you are live. Are you there, caller? Okay, I guess not. We are moving on to caller area code 207. Welcome to the program.
Hi, my name's Mike. I live in Maine.
Hi, Mike.
Hello?
From Maine.
Yeah, okay.
I like that.
So, my father recorded temperatures during the mid-90s, early to mid-90s in Farmington, Maine, with the first frost, and he recorded September 13th to 15th as the first frost in the years he lived there. And now if you look up the average is September 3rd. So in Maine, Maine we call that weather.
Yeah, right. Well, Mike, you've got a very good point. And by the way, there are a lot of long-term personal weather records kept. Jefferson kept one at Monticello, and other people. For example, there's been a reconstruction of these kinds of personal weather records for Central England going back over 300 years. And what they show, of course, is exactly what your father was showing, the variation. Now, the point you raise about weather is extremely important. Very, very few people understand the difference between weather and climate. Weather is what you experience on a day-to-day basis. So if you go outside and you experience the weather, that is the sum total of thousands of variables, including cosmic radiation from deep space and heat coming off the bottom of the oceans and everything else in between.
Yeah, I'm not done.
No, it's okay. Well, I'll get to you in a minute. But here's the thing. The climate is the average of the weather. Okay, so what you do is you take the weather record over a period of time, and you average that out, and that gives you the climate for a region or for a period of time. So that's a very important distinction for people to understand. Yeah, go ahead, Mike. Finish your point.
All right, so now in Maine, we're getting sort of the winters that we got in the 60s, 50s, and 70s. And today happened to be 31 degrees recorded in northern Maine and across the board in northern Maine in the 30s and 40s, which everybody around here is kind of alarmed by. So that's the weather. Here's my personal point of view. I worked in the environmental field analyzing for pesticides, PCBs, volatile organic chemicals from 1990 to 1986 to 1996 in environmental labs. In about 1994, the market for that seemed to dry up, and I happened to be working in Massachusetts, and I was taking classes in that field in the university at Lowell, and I was also attending conferences at Boston University. And about 1994, 95, the professors who were talking about pesticides, PCBs, and those kind of pollutants and Superfund sites, which under the Reagan administration became precedent, started talking about carbon. And then the money seemed to disappear. I didn't understand why it was disappearing at the time. I went and found something else to do in computers because that became the next big thing. With Al Gore's movie. In like 2006, I made an anecdotal switch, like, oh, so that's why the money disappeared.
Yeah, that's a great composition to analyze those two factors together. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Well, Mike, that goes back to my comment to the previous caller, that people very quickly learned which were the key words and which were the issues that the government were looking at and were willing to fund. And to give you an idea of how early I caught on to that, I used to joke about desperately looking for a connection between climate and AIDS, because those were the two things that were shaking money loose from the government. And so people play those games. And you're absolutely right. Gore's influence in directing funding and government's influence in directing fundings really determines so much of what the focus and the concern is. And as you know from your experience with PCBs and computer models and environmental issues, you can detect virtually anything nowadays. But what's really important is the level of that subject or that material. For example, I remember years ago when somebody came out and said that they could now measure to a quintillionth. And I asked a chemist what that meant in layman's terms, and he said a quintillionth is a tablespoon in Lake Superior. Well, if you can detect stuff at that level, you could say, oh, well, we found this toxic material in Lake Superior. But then, and everybody gets panicked and frightened about it. But as Paracelsus said back in the 16th century, the toxicity is in the dosage. And if you don't understand that, then you're going to be very easily scared. But your point about the funding and the direction of the funding and the control of the funding by people like Gore is right, joke about it, right on the money. Very, very interesting observation.
Yeah, that's a very astute point. Well, we're going to go to area code 417. Welcome to the Weekend Report. What is your comment?
My comment is, I was just listening in regard to the geoengineering that's going on, and one of the statistics that was brought during the presentation was, he said, we're losing like 25% of the sun's rays through all this geoengineering and reflecting back with all the metals and chaff or whatever that's being put into the atmosphere. How is that their way of contributing or taking away from global warming? Is that what's driving this, along with some other things?
That's a very, very good question. First of all, geoengineering is in my opinion, humans trying to play God. They think that because we got rid of God, that we're greater than and we can control these things. You hear politicians talking about stopping climate change. Well, I mean, you can't get more arrogant than that. But the geoengineering, we've always attempted to control or direct weather. You could argue, for example, that rain dances and sacrifices, as the Inca did, where they would have blood sacrifices to break a drought or bring rainfall. So that in a way is a form of geoengineering, but it became much more sophisticated in human history. Three major pieces of geoengineering that we did to not control the climate, but to cope with the climate. One was, of course, the control of fire. And if you think about that, the animals' fear of fire, to overcome that, fire not only allowed us to live in areas where we normally wouldn't live, but it also allowed us to eat food by softening the food that we couldn't digest. So the second one, of course, was clothing. That's another form of geoengineering. But the other one that people tend not to think about, and ironically it went on in present-day Iraq and the Fertile Crescent, and that was irrigation. But what happened there was that they were growing crops, and there was normally enough rain, and as it got drier, they went to irrigation to try and maintain the situation. But of course today, in today's world, we're irrigating in areas where there isn't normally vegetation. It's a completely different thing. But in the modern term, geoengineering has been done through cloud seeding to try and create rainfall, silver iodide dropping on the clouds and so on, putting seeding clouds to stop hailstorms and hail damage. But on a larger scale, geoengineering really began during the cold spell from 1940 to 1980, and there were all sorts of proposals to warm up the world. One of them, for example, was a proposal to build a dam across the Bering Straits and block the cold water coming out of the Arctic Ocean and thereby warm up the North Pacific Ocean and warm up around the world. And there were proposals to put massive reflecting mirrors up in space with the new space technology and direct that sunlight into cold northern cities. So these ideas have always been around there. The problem, but of course then when we get into warming, they would say, oh, well, we've got to stop the warming. We've got to put particulates up in the atmosphere. That's what the clouds see, or the chemtrails. The people were shouting, "Oh, you got to slow down global warming." Well, the government can say, "Well, we'll put up chemtrails and we'll block the sunlight coming in." It's like putting a shelter or shade up in a greenhouse, and they claimed that was effective. I don't think it was effective at all, because when you look at the long-term pattern of temperatures and what drives them, what has gone on is all perfectly normal. The cooling trend that we're into now is simply because the sun peaked in its activity in the year 2000 and has been declining ever since. And if you go back and look at the historic record, the temperature plots against solar changes, about 90% of long-term temperature change are related to changes in the sun. But, of course, with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, they're only looking at human causes. So they don't consider the sun. They don't look at the sun. And that was part of my argument with Mr. Keating about the Milankovitch effect and changes in the tilt of the Earth and orbit of the Earth and all these other things. So now, so your question about messing around with the atmosphere, yeah, governments are doing it all the time. But it's because they think they can play God. One of the things they did, for example, was they said, well, we've got to reduce the CO2 in the atmosphere, and the oceans absorb CO2. So if we put iron filings onto the surface of the oceans, that will increase the ability of the number of algae that can absorb the CO2. Well, it turned out to be a disaster, but no thought was given to the environmental damage that would do to that surface of the ocean and the plants and animals living there. And so that goes back to the earlier caller's question about governments messing up everything.
Right. On a personal note, you said you did work in regards to submarine using sound and things of that nature.
Yes.
Yeah, my dad was involved in that. In the 70s.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt you. But one of the things with that I was concerned about and have been all along was, what effect is that having? Because one of the pollutions that humans are guilty of is noise pollution. When I look at these kids going around with their ear pods in, and even Apple have said they try to limit the sound, and the sheer noise of our societies is to me a big problem. But when you consider those animals in the ocean that operate on sound and acoustics, and of course what we were doing was detecting submarines based upon a sound. So we would drop a little depth charge, a 3-pound depth charge, and then that would send out a shock wave, and that would ping off the submarine and come back to our microphone sensors. And so it was kind of like a sonar. But people have no idea how far the sound can travel in the oceans. I remember one night we were sent out to look for what was reported as a dinky diesel, a Russian diesel engine operating off the coast of North America, off Nova Scotia. And it was supposedly in Canadian waters, and we were sent out to find it. They were picking it up on microphones that were all around North America on the bottom of the oceans, and we couldn't locate it at all. It subsequently turned out that what they were picking up was indeed a Russian dinky diesel engine signature, but it was on a Russian freighter leaving Liverpool Harbor in England 3,000 miles away. And so when you think about noise pollution, and I wonder about these whales beaching themselves and things like that, whether that's related to this noise pollution that we've created.
Well, he raised a very good point. We're going to try to get to a few more callers before the end of the program. 714, welcome to the Weekend Report. What is your comment?
Hi, Sheila, and thank you, Doctor. I appreciate the lecture and the whole paradigm of global warming. I don't support, so I'm on your side. But what I'd like to make a comment, I suppose, more than a question, is the Lord wrote us a book called the Bible. I use the King James Version. And he said he created the heavens and the earth, and he did this in 6 days. And so I believe it, and I believe that the earth is about 6,000 plus or minus, 500 years old. I believe that there was the Noah's Ark and the deluge of the waves and all the activity and the deposits and the sudden changes that created the Grand Canyon and why we find fossils on top of the Swiss Alps. So when I look at, and I'm a physician, I've been practicing 36 years, and if I've learned anything as a doctor, I've learned that I don't know a lot of stuff, and the body miraculously heals itself. So when I look at carbon dating, I look at cores of the ice in the Antarctic, and I look at geologists' interpretations, none of them were there, and Job said it, and Psalms say it. He says, where were you when I created the earth? Where were you when I created Leviathan and the seas and so forth? So there's as much argument to draw suspicion to the interpretation of carbon dating and the age of this earth being millions and billions of years old as there is to this global warming idea. I want to interject the word that says we are in God's hands, and he promised that the edges of the seas would not change their borders and the seasons would continue. Otherwise, the Lord would not be the Lord. He promises to keep these things. And more importantly would be then, and I'm just going to say it, share the gospel, the good news, that God loves everyone, red, yellow, black, or white, and he's going to take care of us. And if we can have more people be honest Christians, humbled, then maybe we would have less arrogant scientists and pharmaceuticals who are killing more people than helping them. So that's my comment. What do you say to that?
Excellent. I think that is a fantastically excellent comment.
Doctor, yes, I commend you, first of all, because, of course, in today's society, the two C's are not allowed, Christianity and conservatism. You're not allowed to say that you're those. But your comment about the more you learn, the more you find out you don't know anything, I couldn't agree with you more on that. I remember a student saying to me, well, Dr. Ball, I'm supposed to graduate, and all I found out in 3 years is that I don't know anything. I said, good, you're ready to graduate. And so I couldn't agree with you more on that. The other thing that happened was I taught a course in political geography, and I was looking one evening, we were talking about, or I was talking about, we were discussing the whole idea about political communism and capitalism with regard to environmentalism and so on. And one student piped up and said, one of the best environmental guidelines are in the Bible. And for example, the division in the Bible between domesticated animals and wild animals is absolutely brilliant, and yet nobody would ever look at the Bible from that perspective. Right. But the final comment I'll make to you, and by the way, I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, people say to me, "Oh, well, you know, the Big Bang and all of that stuff." I said, "Yeah, but who created the Big Bang?" You know, I don't care how far back you go or what science discovers. There are certain questions that simply science cannot answer. But I want to make one very important point with you, Doctor, and that is that the argument about Darwin is still front and center, where you've got Richard Dawkins and God is Dead and all of those things. That is an ongoing part of Darwin's role. Darwin was chosen by science, that is the so-called formal academic science, to defeat religion. And Darwin, of course, being an atheist, now he didn't like being in the forefront of things, and on his deathbed he confessed he was wrong. But Darwin was used by science to defeat religion. And when you look at university in Darwin's day, there were two faculties. There was the natural sciences and there was the humanities. But in today's society, the largest faculties are the social sciences. And I've argued that the social sciences developed in the academic world as an attempt to justify why humans are different than all the other animals. But because they're trying to use that to say, well, if we're not here for God's purpose, what purpose are we here for? And so I see all of these things as interrelated and speaking to your particular point of view.
And that is a very good point of view. And we're going to take our last caller. And again, Doctor, thank you very much, area code 714, for that very impressive comment. And I agree with that 100%. Area code 757, we're going to take a last call tonight. Sorry about the other people in the queue. 757, welcome to the program. What is your comment?
My name is Jim, and I am a botanist. I have a BS in ornamental horticulture primarily, but I also went further in other areas. The Navy put me into electronics, and I've also been in video production. So I also have a lot of history interest, and I've read a lot. So here's something. To me, the definition for heat island includes deserts. And the Sahara 7,000 years ago was a grassland supporting a grazing culture. And now it's a desert and it's expanding. And in the 90s, agricultural people trying to improve the agriculture in Central Africa realized the native plants could shrink the Sahara if they had enough of a particular nutrient they were lacking, and it wasn't water. They did extensive research to prove that it was carbon dioxide, because that would increase the heat tolerance and the drought tolerance so that the grasses could go back. They've found out by research 800 parts per million of carbon dioxide available to the grasses, and they could do it. Now, Cornell University says that for growing vegetables in greenhouses in your northern areas, like around the Great Lakes, you need 1,000 parts per million of carbon dioxide in the daytime to be efficient. Now, this is why you can get cucumbers, long, skinny cucumbers in plastic with a label, Canada, and you can get it any time of the year. We get them here in the Mid-Atlantic area in March, which means they had to be growing in December and January. Now, how do you do that? How does it pertain to the desert? In a greenhouse, when the temperature gets up to the area where you don't need to add any more heat, the outside temperature, the sun coming in and everything, you turn off the artificial heat. It's there to keep the temperature up to about let's say 60 degrees. That's what a greenhouse is for, to moderate the temperature extremes. So the greenhouse gas effect they're talking about, the way they talk about things and everything tells me they don't know anything much about greenhouse operations. Cornell University, Oregon State University have online how to do it. So,
Jim,
yes, sir.
Yeah, go ahead. No, just a quick, because we're running out of time, unfortunately.
Yes.
But just a few responses to your points. Yeah, you're very, very right about the level of CO2 and the growth of vegetation. In fact, with a tongue-in-cheek, in one of the briefs we submitted to the Supreme Court with the EPA trying to reduce the level of CO2, we wanted power of attorney for the plants to vote against any attempt to reduce CO2. Your point about them becoming, with increased CO2, plants become more drought tolerant is, as you know, the stomata, that is the pores on the leaves, shrink in size because they take in, because they're not using as much moisture, evapotranspiring, as you know. So, yeah, you're absolutely right about the CO2. Most commercial greenhouses around the world today pump in anywhere between 1,000 and 1,200 parts per million of CO2 in order to increase the yields by a factor of 4. And that's been going on in some parts of the world for 100 years. If you look at the levels of atmospheric CO2 in the record, the average for the last 300 million years has been between 1,000 and 1,200 parts per million. And I have made the argument, and people like Sherwood Idso has been studying plants and CO2 for all of his career. We think that the plants evolved to that as the optimum level for their growth, and that now at 400 parts per million, the plants are actually malnourished. Just one final comment about the deserts. Yes, the Sahara was a grassland 7,000 years ago, because what happens when the ice ages occur, the cold area of the world, the polar regions, expand, and the zones of climate around the world shrink. The one area that gets squeezed out are the desert zones that lie in the latitudes from 15 to 30 degrees of latitude. And they get increased rainfall. The academic term for it is it's a pluvial period. Pluvial, of course, is the Latin word for rain. When you are in an interglacial, that is, the glaciers shrink, and we're currently in an interglacial, then the deserts are going through an interpluvial, that is, the deserts expand. In fact, right now the Sahara Desert is not expanding. That was part of the alarmism that came with desertification. The deserts are expanding and it's overgrazing of the goats and all the rest of it. But again, if you start to put these things into the context of climate and how the climates work and what the climate mechanisms are, you can really see that what's going on right now is perfectly normal. But your comments about CO2 and its function with regard to vegetation are very, very valid. And in fact, there have been studies that show that a 2 bushels per acre increase of yields of crops is due to the increasing CO2 of the last 50 years.
Well, it's interesting, Tim, because an article of faith among the neo-Malthusian greenies is that the world is getting far too warm and far too crowded, so something must be done. And one of the things that, Christopher Keating obviously didn't talk about was the fact that James Hansen raked in a whopping $1.6 million for being NASA's resident alarmist, plus an estimated how many more millions in traveling around the globe for his so-called wisdom. So, it's fortunes and ritzy vacations when you jump into bed with Big Eco.
Well, Hansen, of course, was handpicked by Timothy Worth, who's now the United Nations at the United Nations.
That is correct.
And he was the senator. Right, he was the senator that handpicked. He said, we found this scientist in NASA who was willing to say that human CO2 was causing all of the global warming. And he brought him before the U.S. Senate committee in 1988. But to give you an idea of the level of corruption that's gone on with this, what they did, and you can read about this on a Frontline program, NPR, you can Google it, he admitted that they picked out the hottest day on average of the year in Washington. That's the day they scheduled the meeting for. And the night before, they went in, opened all the windows, and shut off the air conditioning. So they're all sitting there sweating, and here's this man talking about global warming. It was all done deliberately to set a stage. Hansen was, as the head of NASA GIS, was actually picketing in front of the White House as a senior bureaucrat. He also flew to England and gave evidence against 4 Greenpeace people who had bombed a coal plant, and he gave evidence on their behalf as a bureaucrat for NASA GIS. And in other words, he broke the Hatch Act in every way possible, yet nothing was done to him.
Yeah.
And when I spoke to Hansen's boss, John Toon, John waited till he retired, and I spoke to John in Washington, and he said, look, first of all, Hansen claimed he was muscled by the White House. He never was. And I said, well, why wasn't he charged under the Hatch Act? And he said, we were told from very high up to leave him alone. And so this is what was going on, the complete corruption of NASA GIS. And now, by the way, they've got in charge of it Gavin Schmidt, an Englishman who was involved in the leaked emails at the Climatic Research Unit in England. So the corruption continues.
Well, and thanks to Michael Mann's Al Gore-endorsed school children scaring, politician galvanizing hockey stick. I mean, you got to remember that Steve McIntyre and Ross McKintrick, they tried to replicate that most famous of all climatological reconstructions, who Keating has no issue with. They were stonewalled by man every turn, and when they pressed on to discover what the graph relied on, well, it was computer algorithms, Tim, so skewed that it would produce a hockey stick more than 99% of the time, regardless of the data you fed into it. In other words, it was fudged. It's been debunked, but of course, according to Keating, he has no problem with it. So just absolutely incredible. And, let's not forget, it's absolutely incredible that, the IPCC, according to Obama, is the gold standard of international climate science. But the truth is, it was set up for a political reason. And, obviously, it's run by the good old yoga-loving, ice-shunning, bearded railway engineer, Pachura. How is a railway engineer a top climatologist? This just blows my mind. And, Tim, there are 5 assessment reports. There are 5 assessment reports have been out to lunch, and the latest report, it's truly sunk to a level of hilarious incoherence. Come on.
Oh, absolutely. And, of course, that's the whole thing about science, as the callers are saying. A good definition, a very simple definition, but powerful because it's simple, is the ability to predict. If you can't predict, your science is wrong, period.
Yeah,
every single prediction they've made has been wrong. So that's all you need to know.
Well, the EPA is getting tired of the boring dregs of protecting endangered darter snails. I guess it's spreading its wings. But anyway, it was just a fantastic program, Tim. Folks, again, we thank you for tuning in tonight. We want to thank you for calling in. Please support our program. We want to have you support us not only with your prayers, but your dollars so we can stay on the air. Go to weekendvigilante.com, click on the donate, do what you can. Thank you in advance for that, folks. And, of course, we want to just wrap up by saying we want to tell you that, we do care about you as listeners. You're our family. And, of course, we always encourage you to, get involved with what we print. Tim Ball's website. Tim, give out your website for folks. You've got excellent articles up.
Yeah, my website is drtimball.com, drtimball.com, all lowercase.
And I really want to encourage people to get your book. Of course, if you go on Amazon, it's available all over the place. The title of the book is The Deliberate Corruption of Climate Science. It's an excellent book. I have a signed copy, and I've read it, and it's fantastic. And again, Tim, we're going to have to hurry up and get our Cool It Al Gore out in the new year.
Yep. Yeah, the other thing I'd like to mention briefly is that I've made a documentary with Luke Dillard from Austin, Texas, called The Global Warming War. and that's available on my website as well. And we're getting rave reviews about it because it doesn't attempt to persuade you one way or the other. It just says, look, here's the questions, and then they have a whole series of scientific experts answering those questions, and then at the end basically it says make up your own mind. And that's what I hope we all can do, because we're one of the things about today's world is everybody is telling us what to think.
Well, yeah, and I posted that. It's an excellent documentary. And, folks, if you add us on Twitter, you can just go to Weekend Vigilante Facebook page and Weekend Vigilante Twitter, and you'll get updates on everything that we put out a lot of stuff. So, and again, just thanks for tuning in tonight, and we will see you next weekend. Thanks for tuning in.
Broadcasting to the world, it's the Weekend Report with Hagmann and Hagmann and the Weekend Vigilante.